morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of Sikh Federation International, distinguished representatives of United Nations institutions and estimate media representatives. It's a great honor for me to welcome you in Geneva during the United Nations Human Rights Council's 61st session. And it's a great pleasure for Baku Initiative Group and Sikh Federation to convene such important international conference dedicated to Indian transnational repression during such important period. Before commence our conference, I suggest to begin the event with a moment of silence to honor memory of our brothers Hardeep Singh Nijjar and Avtar Singh Khanda. Rest in peace. Thank you. Dear participants, today we gathered such respectable members of Sikh Federation International, respectable experts, lawyers, and struggles in order to discuss the grave challenge, intimidations, tortures, assassinations, surveillance, coercive pressures conducted by Indian government against Sikh community. Today also our event's main purpose is to deliver credible information and evidences to the international community regarding above mentioned violations against Sikh diasporas. I would not like to take your time with my long welcome note. I'm giving the floor to my friend, to my brother, our honorable chair of Sikh Federation, Maninder Singh. The floor is yours.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਪਹਿਲੋਂ ਤਾਂ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਜੋ ਇੱਥੇ ਪਹੁੰਚੇ ਨੇ ਤੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਗਲੋਬਲ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਏ ਆ ਇੱਕ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਆ ਜੋ ਹਿੰਦ ਹਕੂਮਤ ਨੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਪਿਛਲੇ 40 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਤਕਰੀਬਨ ਕਹਿ ਲਓ ਕਿ 75 ਸਾਲ ਹੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਦੇਸ਼ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਬਣਾਇਆ ਹੈ ਗੋਰਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਉਦੋਂ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਹੁਣ ਤੱਕ ਜੋ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਭਵਿੱਖ ਨੂੰ ਤੈਅ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਜੋ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜਦੋਜਹਿਦ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਸੰਘਰਸ਼ ਲੜਿਆ ਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਗਾਂ ਦੀ ਗਾਂ ਜਿੰਨੀਆਂ ਸ਼ਹੀਦੀਆਂ ਪਾਈਆਂ ਆ 1984 ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਤੱਕ ਜਦੋਂ ਭਾਜੀ ਹਰਦੀਪ ਸਿੰਘ ਨਿੱਜਰ ਭਾਈ ਅਵਤਾਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਖੰਡੇ ਦੀ ਸ਼ਹੀਦੀਆਂ ਹੋਈਆਂ ਉਹ ਸਭ ਕੁਝ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਆ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹਕੂਮਤ ਆ ਇਹ ਕਿਉਂ ਬਾਹਰਲੇ ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਕਾਰਕੁਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਐਕਟਿਵਿਸਟ ਨੂੰ ਟਾਰਗੇਟ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਾਲ ਇਹਦੇ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟਾਰਗੇਟਿੰਗ ਅਸੈਸੀਨੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਆ ਇਹ ਸਿਰਫ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਆ ਸਿਰਫ ਤੇ ਸਿਰਫ ਅਸੈਸੀਨੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਥ੍ਰੈਟ ਕਰਨਾ ਵੀਜ਼ੇ ਦੇ ਰਿਫਿਊਜ਼ਲ ਕਰਨਾ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦਖਲਅੰਦਾਜ਼ੀ ਕਰਨੀ ਇੱਕ ਡਰ ਪੈਦਾ ਕਰਨਾ ਚੁੱਪ ਵੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਲਿਜਾਣਾ ਆ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਕਿ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਚੁੱਪ ਕਰਾਉਣਾ ਆ ਸਿਰਫ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਰੀਰਕ ਮੌਤ ਆ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਿਸੇ ਕੌਮ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦਬਾਅ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਚੁੱਪ ਕਰਾਉਣਾ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਹੀਲੇ ਵਸੀਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਧਮਕੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਆਉਂਦਾ ਆ ਸੋ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਦਾਇਰਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਆ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਇਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਆ ਇਹ ਸਿਰਫ ਤੇ ਸਿਰਫ 2 ਸ਼ਹੀਦੀਆਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਹੋਈਆਂ ਜਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਹੋਣੀਆਂ ਸੀ ਸਿਰਫ ਉਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗਾ ਇਹ ਪਿਛਲੇ 40 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ 1984 ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਬਾਹਰਲੇ ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਯੂਰਪ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ UK ਤੋਂ US ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਆਸਟ੍ਰੇਲੀਆ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੀ ਆਬਾਦੀ ਬਹੁ ਗਿਣਤੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਸੀਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਬੈਠੇ ਹਾਂ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਇੰਡੀਅਨ ਸਟੇਟ ਨੇ ਆਪਣਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਜਾਲ ਵਿਛਾਏ ਆ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਪਾਈ ਨੈਟਵਰਕਸ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪੈਦਾ ਕੀਤੇ ਆ ਜਾਸੂਸਾਂ ਦੇ ਰਾਹੀਂ ਇਨਫੋਰਮੇਸ਼ਨ ਗੈਦਰਿੰਗ ਅਤੇ ਸਰਵੇਲੈਂਸ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ ਤੇ ਧਮਕੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਗੋਲੀਆਂ ਤੱਕ ਉਹ ਵਧੇ ਨੇ। ਸੋ ਇਹ ਸਭ ਕੁਝ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਅੱਜ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਡਿਸਕਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ। ਮੈਜੋਰਿਟੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਹੋਣੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਹੋਣੀ ਹੈ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਕੋਈ ਅਖੀਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਦੋਂ ਕੋਈ ਸਵਾਲ ਜਵਾਬ ਹੋਣੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਕਰਕੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਇਹ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਕਰਨੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਕੁ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਕਰਕੇ ਇਹਦੀ ਰਿਕਾਰਡਿੰਗ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਕਈ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਮੀਡੀਆਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਣੀ ਆ, ਭਾਵੇਂ ਉਹ ਸਿੱਖ ਸਿਆਸਤ ਆ ਜਾਂ TV84 ਆ ਜਾਂ ਹੋਰਾਂ, ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਸਾਡੀ ਮਿਲਣੀ ਹੈ ਦੇਖਣ ਲਈ। ਸੋ ਮੈਂ ਸਿਰਫ ਇੰਨੀ ਗੱਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂਆਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ। ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਓਪਨਿੰਗ ਰਿਮਾਰਕਸ I'll move over to English now. I'd like to first thank everyone that's attended today from the various places around the world that everyone's come. I'd like to point out the fact that the Sikh community is a global community with diasporas that exist across the entire world in large numbers. Transnational repression is something that affects every Sikh community in any number and almost every country that we exist. And the primary reason for that transnational repression is the Sikh call for sovereignty in the form of Khalistan. And right now I'd like to acknowledge that we have members of the Sikh community here from Canada, the United States, UK, Germany, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Portugal, and Italy. And we have members of the Sikh Federation delegation that are representing all of those spaces. We also have international media in the form of DW from Germany, BBC from the UK, Azerbaijan media that has come from Azerbaijan with our partners Baku Initiative Group. We have other community members, the Global Movement for the Freedom of Kashmir. We have distinguished delegates here from their movement as well. We have other delegates that will be joining us from the Tamil movement, seeking independence from Sri Lanka. And we also have distinguished guests from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations that is attending here as well today. And our focus on transnational repression is something that our partner organizations from Kashmir and our Tamil communities well understand that as well. And the Office of the High Commissioner also deals with the issue of transnational repression. So we have a very vibrant audience today, which will lead to a very interesting conversation around transnational repression. I have a couple of comments that I'd like to make before we get into the actual program detail in session one. In June of 2023, by Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a dear friend and community pillar and a respected Sikh leader was assassinated outside of a Gurdwara in Surrey, BC. He was an individual committed to seva, to justice, and to the peaceful advocacy of Sikh self-determination in the form of Khalistan. So killing was not only an attack on him, it was an attack on the Sikh community globally, an attack on Canada's sovereignty as well, and on the fundamental norms that govern international relations. Just a few days earlier, Avtar Singh Khanda, another prominent activist and organizer in the UK, died under circumstances that the Sikh community for sure believes was the Indian state assassinating him. Avtar was a young and brilliant and fearless individual. He inspired countless Sikh youth to believe in their voice, their agency, and their right to shape their own political destiny. These were not isolated tragedies. They form a part of a pattern that governments, human rights organizations, and international institutions are now openly acknowledging. India's campaign of transnational repression, targeting Sikh activists worldwide. Today's conference is about demanding accountability. It is about insisting that no state, no matter how powerful, should be allowed to export repression, fear, or political violence into the sovereign territory of other nations. It is about affirming that the right to dissent, the right to organize, and the right to imagine a different political future are not crimes. They are protected freedoms. It's also about something deeper. It's about the right of the Sikh people to determine their own destiny. Self-determination is not a slogan, it's a principle enshrined in the UN Charter. More importantly, Raj as a principle, or self-governance or self-determination, is a principle given to the Sikh people by their gurus. So moreover international norms, Sikhs are obligated as a people to not only free themselves, but also help free the oppressed people all over the world, just as their gurus have inscribed them to do. If the Sikh movement for Khalistan were irrelevant, India would ignore it. If it were weak, India would dismiss it. But the desperation to silence Sikh voices globally tells a different story. It tells us that our movement is alive. It tells us that the movement is principled. and it tells us that the movement is effective. Yet despite the fears that these acts were meant to instill within Sikhs, something remarkable has happened. The Sikh people have not retreated, they have not gone silent, they have not cowered. Instead, they have become more organized, more connected, and more determined than ever. Gurdwaras have become hubs for political education. Youth have stepped into leadership roles with confidence and clarity. International allies, from governments to parliamentarians to human rights organizations to media, have begun to speak out with unprecedented force. This resilience is not accidental, it's rooted in Sikh history, in Sikh identity, and in the Sikh spirit that refuses to bow to injustice. Our community has endured genocide, state violence, and decades of repression, and each time we have emerged stronger, more united, and more committed to justice. So as we begin today's discussions, let us honor the memory of Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar and Bhai Avtar Singh Khanda, not with silence, but with purpose. Let us honor them by ensuring that their work continues, that their voices echo through ours, and that their sacrifices strengthen our resolve. The message we send today is simple. Transnational repression will not break the Sikh people, assassinations will not erase our leaders, and intimidation will not deter a movement rooted in justice, dignity, and the universal right to self-determination. If anything, these attacks confirm that the Sikh struggle for freedom in the form of Khalistan is on the right path, because only a threatened state behaves with such desperation the way India is behaving. Again, I thank you for being here, for standing together, and for refusing to be silent. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Abbasov, Executive Director for the Baku Initiative Group, to present on the activities of Baku Initiative Group in a global context. I'd actually just make a couple of comments here. If you could please turn your phones to silent so there's no disruption during the event. And then we'll be breaking up into 3 different sessions that we will hold, where we'll have opportunity for comments and question and answer as we go through. And I hand it over now to Mr. Abbasov. Thank you, Abbas, for the introduction to the Baku Initiative Group. We move now towards the opening of the first session, which will be more of a historical background on what transnational repression is for the Sikh community. We'll have 3 different speakers in this session and an opportunity for questions. The opening will be done by myself on the historical, philosophical, and political foundations that actually have led to transnational repression for the Sikh community. And our task today is to examine the phenomenon of transnational repression targeting Sikh communities and to situate it within the broader historical context of the Sikh struggle for sovereignty and self-determination. This can't be simply done in what we're seeing in the modern day in the last 3 years or the last 5 years of the violence that we've seen from the Indian state that's been inflicted on Sikh diasporas. To get a deeper look into actually why this transnational repression actually exists, we do have to take a quick look at the historical context of the Sikh people and this idea of transnational repression and where it kind of like forms from. I will touch on a few pieces for the Sikh colleagues in the room and the Sangat in the room. They will be well aware of many of these principles, but for our guests in the room, these are fundamental pieces that we have to actually touch on in order to understand the Sikh people and where transnational repression now is formulating from. I will start with the Sikh identity in and of itself. Its framework on doctrinal foundations are built off of a principle of midi and bidi. The Sikh political tradition begins with this principle, introduced by Guru Har Gobind Sahib in the 17th century. The doctrine asserts that spiritual sovereignty, which is bidi, and temporal sovereignty, which is midi, are inseparable, 2 sides of the same coin. There's not a separation of church and state per se, as we see in many of the Western doctrines. Sikh political and philosophical doctrines are connected as 2 sides of the same coin. It establishes that ethical governance, resistance to injustice, the defense of human dignity are integral to Sikh religious life, not only for ourselves, but in the concept of sarvata pala, which is the welfare of all. This translates then to all of global humanity at that point. In academic terms, midi-pidi represents a fusion of political theology, social ethics, and producing a community that views political agency as a moral obligation rather than a secular pursuit. Historical trajectory that we have to look at from our Guru's period until now, and I'll keep this brief. Guru Nanak's critique of political and social hierarchies laid the groundwork for a distinct Sikh socio-political identity. Guru Arjan's martyrdom in 1606, their Shahidi, marked the transition from a spiritual descent to political resistance. And Guru Gobind Singh's creation of the Khalsa in 1699 formalized a sovereign collective identity committed to justice and self-rule in the principle of Raj. The Sikh Confederacy and Khalsa Raj that was established in the 18th and 19th centuries, those were actually pivotal to the way that Sikhs are behaving today, reclaiming that lost identity. When we speak to the idea of Khalistan, it is not the establishment of something new. It is the reclaiming of a sovereignty that was once lost, and there is a fundamental difference between the two. That reclaiming something that was yours, reclaiming something that you had, versus creating something absolutely new. The Indian state has constantly taken this narrative with the Sikh people that this is an affront to their territorial integrity, but it is a territorial integrity that the Sikh people will say shouldn't have existed in the first place. Many communities, from the Sikh people to Kashmir to Bengal to others across that Indian subcontinent, the term India never actually existed. It's a Western construct. We had many confederacies, many kingdoms, many political systems, languages, cultures, religions that lived in social cohesion to a degree in that subcontinent, and they had self-rule and governance. The idea or the construct of India in and of itself is a fallacy, and that is what we're here to challenge as well. That after the British occupation, after British colonization, what was left afterwards for the Sikh people, for the Kashmiri people, for many other minorities that live within India, was basically the only difference was that the chains of slavery went from a white hand, a European hand, into the hands of the Brahmin, which now controls the entire subcontinent. I think we fast forward to the 1980s, where state violence and transformation of the Sikh political consciousness started reshaping itself. Post-1947, Sikhs fought for greater autonomy. That was in the form of the Anandpur Sahib resolution, a resolution that was really pointed towards greater autonomy for all states, for minorities across the entire subcontinent, not just the Sikh people in Punjab. That changed in 1984. Post-1984, there is no struggle for greater autonomy to exist within the Indian state. There is only one goal for the Sikh people, which is to become completely independent in the form of Punjab and Khalistan. That fundamental shift happened because of the attack on Darbar Sahib, the destruction of the Akal Takht, the highest political authority and seat of the Sikh nation. It happened because of tens of thousands of Sikhs being slaughtered across the subcontinent. It happened because of a genocide that was perpetrated in November of 1984 against the Sikh people. And it happened because of 10 years of repression, oppression, and suppression of the Sikh voice in the form of genocide in Punjab. And it happened because 30 years after that mid-90s decade, that Sikhs still are looking at faces that are their killers, are sitting in positions of power, impunity for those political actors, for those police officers, for those security officers, for the generals of their army, all the way through and through, that impunity reigns supreme. That justice in that term does not exist for Sikhs within the Indian state and its boundaries. And when you are existing in an ecosystem like that, there's something that one of our leaders, one of our greatest leaders in the 20th century, Sant Jarnail Singh Ji Khalsa Pinarawale said, that he said that this is not discrimination. He gave us a term to use in the 1980s that is relevant up until today. That discrimination for us would be that we can fight within the state, we can right the wrongs of the state, that we can have equal opportunity within the state. He gave us a term, gulami, that what you're facing is slavery. Slavery is occupation. Slavery is not just being second-class citizens, it is being subhuman at the end of the day. And that's why genocide can happen, is when you're characterized as subhuman. And for us to always understand that as Sikh people in our trajectory, is that out of discrimination, you fight within the state, within its boundaries, within its judiciary, within its laws, and we've seen that fail repeatedly over and over again and over and over again. And out of gulami, as Sanjanal Singh said, only comes azadi. Out of slavery only comes freedom. So characterize it as what it is. This is slavery, this is gulami, and what we're aiming for is azadi, which is freedom. I think that understanding the transnational repression, as I started earlier on, that transnational repression refers to efforts by states to silence dissent beyond their borders. Academic literature identifies several mechanisms for this to happen: surveillance of diaspora communities, intimidation of activists, interference in religious institutions, which Sikh community is well aware of, coercion of family members in the home country. This could be that you're an activist living in Germany or in Switzerland or in Italy or in the UK or Canada or any diaspora country, and a mechanism to silence you is to threaten, harm, torture, abduct your family members in Punjab in order to make you silent in the country that you live in. That is also a form of transnational repression. Disinformation campaigns. The Indian state is well known for disinformation and misinformation. The disinformation campaigns to characterize Sikhs as extremists, as terrorists all across the entire globe, this is not something new. This has been going on since 1984. To paint the Khalistan movement as an extremist movement, as a terrorist movement, is something the Indian government spends millions, if not billions of dollars on globally every year. And then there's targeted violence. So transnational repression is not only in the form of physical violence, threats, coercion, and other means are also used, but the targeted violence physically is something that we've seen in the last few years. And it's not just in Canada and the US. We have seen targeted assassinations of Paramjit Singh Panjwar in Pakistan. We have seen the targeted assassination of Harmeet Singh PhD in Pakistan. We have seen the Indian government reach out to the UK in the form of Bhai Avtar Singh Khanda, in Canada in the form of Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar, and the attempt in the United States on Gurpatwant Singh Pannu. And there were supposed to be, as per the US indictment, many more targets that they were after. And that includes European countries, that includes the UK, that includes Canada and America, and Australia and New Zealand, anywhere the global diaspora exists. So we've seen a trajectory from the Indian government to using coercion and threats and disinformation campaigns, and their desperation has now led them to physical violence. And for the Sikh community, that transnational repression, the increase in its power, in its visibility, it shows us something. It shows us that the movement for Khalistan, the movement for our sovereignty, is actually effective. Otherwise, it would not be going to this desperation and length to try and silence our voices in these Western countries. From an analytical perspective, Sikh activists become targets because they challenge dominant state narratives. This challenge of dominant state narratives is in the form of the Indian state repression. And I would like to kind of point out here that this transnational repression for the Sikh community is not limited to just those that are outright and openly speaking about Khalistan. Although they are the primary target, it also goes to anyone speaking about any rights for Punjab, whether those be economical, whether it was the farmers' protest, and we'll hear about that later on today as well, whether it's linguistic or cultural. Repression from India is anything that is for greater rights for the Sikh community or for Punjab as a whole. So limiting it to just the Khalistan movement and just those that believe in Khalistan is not actually true either. The power of the Indian state, which they're trying to exert, and they're failing, is to silence voices through these coercion, threats, and violence. But from our perspective, Sikh activists also mobilize international human rights frameworks, as we're doing right now in Geneva, through interventions in the Human Rights Council General Assembly, to meetings with special rapporteurs, to reports that are being written against India, with complaints that are being filed by the Sikh community. They maintain independent institutions. We jatheband ourselves, we organize ourselves into institutions in the last 10 years or so that are being highly effective in international agencies and in international platforms. And also, Sikh youth now are articulating political aspirations that are rooted in historical and religious legitimacy. We don't need to change who we are in order to establish what we want. We don't need to dilute and compromise our language as Sikhs, where we have the Dava of Badshai from our Guru, which is sovereignty, which is always with us, that promise, where the principle of Raj and self-determination and self-rule given to us by Guru Gobind Singh, and then the idea of Khalistan in the modern world as established in 1986 with the Declaration of Khalistan. 40 years later, we still stand on that declaration. The foundation of Khalistan was made in 1984, as Sanjanal Singh said. We are building on that foundation generation to generation. And one thing I would say as I'm closing, the Indian state has not recognized is that they lost the day they entered Darbar Sahib. That loss will come 40 years later, 100 years later, or 200 years later. We don't know. But one thing we do know is that every generation of Sikhs will push the idea of Raj, Badshai, and Khalistan until its establishment. Whether there's one Sikh left, and we refer to them as Sawa Lakh, or 125,000, or there's 125,000 of us, or there's millions of us. The idea of Khalistan is now ingrained within the Sikh psyche that until its establishment, Sikhs will continue to raise their voices and fight back. When we raise our voices and fight back, the Indian state will use its brutal mechanisms of torture, of abduction, of fake encounters. They will try to use violence to silence us. But we are a community, and I speak to my Sikh brothers and sisters here, that ਸਾਡੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਮਨੂ ਸਾਡੀ ਦਾਤਰੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਮਨੂ ਦੇ ਸੋਏ ਜਿਉਂ ਮਨੂ ਵਰਦਾ ਸੀ ਦੂਨ ਸਵਾਨ ਹੋਏ, that the more we are cut, the more we are eliminated, we grow double in that kind of form. That this idea that violence will silence us or eliminate us is an impossibility. Many have tried and many have failed. So our movement towards our self-determination, this transnational repression in one way can be seen as something that is desperate on the behalf of the Indian government. And I'll end with any analysis of Sikh political aspirations must account for the ethical framework of Sarvata Pala. This principle ensures that Sikh political thought is anti-authoritarian, committed to minority rights, oriented towards justice, and inclusive of all communities. It positions Sikh political agency within a broader human rights paradigm, emphasizing the welfare of all rather than the advancement of a single person or community. Finally, the contemporary Sikh movement, whether expressed through advocacy or scholarship or community organizing, it has to be understood within this long arc of history and philosophy. It is impossible to understand transnational repression against the Sikh people today if we do not understand the Sikh people as a people. Transnational repression does not emerge in a vacuum. It emerges when a community possesses a strong political identity. That identity is rooted in historical sovereignty. The community maintains the independent institutions. The community mobilizes effectively across borders. And the state perceives this as a challenge and a threat to its authority. The Sikh case exemplifies how religious identity, political history, and human rights discourse intersect to shape both activism and repression. As we begin today's discussions, it is essential to ground our analysis in this broader context. Understanding the Sikh struggle for self-determination in the form of Khalistan requires understanding the Sikh tradition itself, its doctrines, its history, its ethical commitments, and its enduring resilience. At this time, I'd like to pass the floor over to Devinderjeet Singh. Devinderjeet Singh will be speaking to transnational repression, how it's rooted within the Sikh framework, and also from the 1980s and 90s as a background, how that transnational repression existed during the time of the Sikh struggle for Khalistan in the 80s and 90s, and how that's transformed into what we see before us today. By Devinderjeet Singh, the floor is yours.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਮੈਂ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨੀ, ਮੈਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਹੀ ਸਿੰਘਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਦਿੰਦਾ, ਬਿਕੋਜ਼ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਇੱਥੇ ਤੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਰਹਿਣੀ, ਇਹ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ 'ਚ ਜਾਣੀ। The title of this event has the words transnational repression, but it also has the words Sikh resistance. So throughout my speech, I will be referring to examples of Sikh resistance, because if there wasn't Sikh resistance, there wouldn't be transnational repression. Transnational repression is not new for Sikhs. As far as the Sikh diaspora is concerned, it needs to be looked at in two ways, pre-Modi and post-Modi. In terms of what happened pre-Modi, I'll refer to, and I'll also talk about what's happened in the last 11 years, but I'm going to then stop because that's going to link to our next session. I will remind you, today is a very important day, 13th of March, in Sikh history, in Sikh resistance. And it will also tell you, with this example, the mindset of the Indian political class. On the 13th of March, 1940, Shaheed Udham Singh went to Caxton Hall and he assassinated O'Dwyer. That happened today, 86 years ago. That was Sikh resistance. For the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh in 1990, he went to London. And what was the reaction of Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru? Mahatma Gandhi called him insane. Jawaharlal Nehru said he was senseless, but the people regarded him as a hero. Today, everyone says Shaheed Udham Singh was a freedom fighter. So 86 years ago, the Indian political class, that's how they viewed Sikh resistance. And we should never forget this, and I will give you some examples. But that example on today is very important. The issue of transnational repression, which is things happening outside of India to the Sikh diaspora, is where our focus is. If you look, the next main period is 1947. When Punjab was divided, many Sikhs left Punjab and went to other countries to get a better life because they could see what was happening. So in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, many Sikhs came into different countries, and most of their effort was to establish their lives, their families, build their homes, and they faced huge discrimination. And in countries like the UK, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, we've overcome much of that discrimination, but that discrimination is rife across Europe. I know the various Sikhs that have come from different European are still fighting those battles that we had in the 60s and 70s. And that means that your focus goes away from what our ultimate struggle is. But the Indian government plays a role here. They deliberately create problems for you so you don't focus on our main struggle. So I'm going to fast forward. 1970s. The first example of transnational repression rearing its ugly head was in 1971 in the UK. And it was because the word Khalistan was used. Jagjit Singh Chauhan raised that issue of Khalistan in 1971 in the UK, and immediately the Indian government thought, these Sikhs that are sitting abroad, we thought they were just bogged down in their own problems. Now the word Khalistan was first used in 1971 in the diaspora. The next major event in Sikh history, 13th of April 1978. The event happens in Amritsar. 13 Sikhs are shot dead. What did it do to the diaspora? Some of us, some of you, woke up. What are we doing here in foreign countries if Sikhs are being shot dead in Amritsar? That was one wake-up call, and that is in today's legacy everywhere we live. But the events of 1984, the attack on Darbar Sahib, created not tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but millions of Sikhs could not accept what the Indian government did. That's when transnational repression kicked in a massive scale. In every single country across the globe where Sikhs live, the Indian authorities said, we need to know who are these Sikhs that are criticizing India? Who are the Sikhs that are demanding Khalistan? Because as Bhai Maninder Singh said, Sant Jarnail Singh Ji Khalsa Pindranwale said that the foundation stone of Khalistan would be laid if the Indian army entered Darbar Sahib. So for many of us, the events of 1978 woke up a few, but the events of 1984 woke up millions. And there's no going back. And the Indian state knows that. So what did they do next? They gathered information in every single country, in every single town where Sikhs live. And we've got proof of this. More than 20 years earlier, a BBC journalist was in Punjab. He met Indian intelligence officers. I'm talking 2004. And they said, we have tens of thousands of files on individual Sikhs living in the UK. We've been having those files since 1984. It didn't happen just in the UK. It didn't just happen in Canada or the US or Germany. It happened everywhere. The Indian state, following the events of 1984, started surveilling you. They started watching you. They started gathering information on you. But then what they did is they whittled down those tens of thousands of files they've created to hundreds, and they created the blacklist. And I know in this room, and I know you personally, some of you are on that blacklist. After 1984, your names are entered on that blacklist, and you remain on that blacklist, and they forced you into exile. So you could not return to Punjab. This was happening before Modi. The reason why I'm talking about this is this was happening before Modi came to power. This started in 1984. Then in 1985, two events happened. The Indian state was so worried by the demand for Khalistan after the Darbar Sahib attack and the reaction from Sikhs, not just across the globe, but in Punjab itself, the Sarbat Khalsa of 1986, 26th of January 1986, that massive gathering sent a signal to Delhi the Sikhs were alive. And on the 29th of April 1986, the declaration of Khalistan came. These were historic moments that people in Punjab, and some of you were there at the time in Punjab, but then had to flee because of persecution, because of torture, because of encounters. But in 1985, the Indian government, colluding with foreign governments, used agents provocateurs in Canada and in the UK to defame the Sikhs. And I don't need to go into those two events of 1985, but it was to damage the Khalistan movement. It was a genuine movement. They did things that you think states don't do? You think they don't blow up planes to kill a few hundred people if it suits their aims? That's exactly what they did. But we've been defamed and we've accepted that. But we challenge that. Because the way states use people, they use agents provocateurs. They are people within us they use to demonize Sikhs, and the Indian state has been doing this well before Modi came along. Let me now move towards Modi. Before Modi came along, they banned Sikh organizations in 2001 in the UK. Nowhere else in the globe, not even in India. Why the UK? 2 years later, they banned them in Canada, the same two organizations. We fought that struggle, and 10 years ago to the day, the UK Parliament lifted the ban on those two organizations because we were told straight away by politicians it was a political ban. The Indian government applied pressure to say, look, we've done everything to these people, but these Sikhs living abroad will not remain silent. They will remain resisting. So in March 2016, it was an historic moment when in Parliament, the UK government had to lift the ban, and it was a sign of Sikh resistance. And because I'm not following my speech at all, you know, Kamji Singh Chal, 6 years, 3 months, held in arbitrary detention, without trial, without a case, one other Sikh, went to the European Court of Human Rights and won that case. And thousands of people, Sikhs, non-Sikhs, across Europe have been able to use that to do. That was another example of Sikh resistance. But then, let's look at Modi. They tried everything before Modi. But Modi came into power and he did two things. And I'm going to finish very quickly. The first thing he did was he got Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor, to produce dossiers. In every country we live, dossiers were given to those governments to say, these are the people that still live in your country and we want you to take action. That's what happens. States give other states information. It depends what those states do with it. But they also said, you know those people we put on the blacklist, can we buy them off? France, Germany, UK, Canada, I don't need to name them. They effectively said, we won't just give dossiers to governments, we'll go to some of these individuals that have been on the blacklist and we'll say, you're welcome to come to India, but there are conditions. And some of them, and you know some of them because they're from your countries, then started singing the praises of Narendra Modi. That's what states do. They blacklist you and then they bribe you or they threaten your family members in Punjab. But ultimately, that failed as well. The Khalistan movement in the diaspora has got stronger. In the last 5 or 6 years, the Khalistan movement has got to such a level. It's not many of you that were born in Punjab that came and had that hurt of what happened to your families, witnessing the events of 1978 and 1984. That's fine. I was born in the UK. Many of the youngsters here were born abroad. But that feeling, the Gulami that Maninder Singh talked about, that Gulami doesn't exist in us because it's never been in our blood. And the Indian state can't handle this. These are their words. There are 3 things they fear from Sikhs abroad. You protest in large numbers. They don't understand that. Well, after all these years, why are Sikhs still protesting? Secondly, media. We have the ability, we have our own media, and we have the ability to get into mainstream media and talk about Khalistan. We have papers. We have a letter from Indira Gandhi on the 30th of June, 1984, to Margaret Thatcher to say target all Sikhs, especially those with a visible identity. That's what they did in the UK. I'm sure they did it in Canada, did it in America. It's just that we have the letters. What did they do? They told the BBC and ITV, not to interview people that talk about Khalistan. They banned the march in November 1984 when your brothers and sisters were being burned alive in Delhi and other cities. This is what governments do. This transnational repression has been going on. But then Modi ultimately took the decision, and he spoke about it in April 2024 in an election rally. He said, we don't give dossiers anymore. We go into their homes and we kill them. Every single government heard that. The Canadian government did it, they had an example. The UK government heard it, they had an example. I know we're going to have a speaker from Europe to talk about some of the European examples. There are many examples, and there are many that have never been shared publicly because governments suppress this information. But I'm going to stop there, and I do apologize for I moved completely off script. But I think the main purpose of me setting that up, saying Sikhs have always resisted and always will, it's in our DNA. And the Indian government has played their last card, which is we will go to your countries and we will kill you. And our response is, if you kill one, then there will be thousands that follow. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
I'd like to thank Devinderjit Singh for the in the 80s and 90s especially on transnational repression and the difference in what we've seen from a pre-Modi era into now the Modi era, we can refer to it as. I wanted to make a couple of comments here just around there's a deep-rooted laws within the Indian state that they utilize to repress people on the ground in Punjab. Their transnational repression goes outside of those means, but we have to look at what they're doing to subdue people within the state itself as well. And I wanted to make a kind of like a relation here as to like when I spoke initially about the idea of Sarvata Pala and us standing up for other communities or building solidarity with other communities. It'll give you an example, just a short one for those of our colleagues that are not from the Sikh community and maybe are trying to understand India better. There's a Terrorist Activities Detention Act that was referred to as TADA commonly in the 1980s and 90s. Human Rights Watch stated that over 76,000 individuals between 1987 and 1995 were arrested under TADA. Over 50% of those individuals were Sikhs in Punjab. Sikhs constitute less than 2% of the population of India. Disproportionately high numbers for the Punjab and the Sikh people. There was a less than 1% conviction rate for those individuals as well. But the detention of those individuals could be decades. And we still see individuals to this day, Bandi Singhs or Sikh political prisoners, as we refer them to as, that are still languishing in prisons long after their sentences have been completed, initially being brought in under TADA in the first place. Now, if we kind of shift that lens from the 1980s and 90s, India moved over to the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is UAPA. And if we look at our brothers and sisters in Kashmir right now, it's been documented through the United Nations that more than 50% of all cases of UAPA are actually in Kashmir. Kashmir is one of the most highly militarized zones in the entire world, just like Punjab was in the 1980s. In just 1,200 cases that have been looked at by the United Nations, there's a 0.8% conviction rate on those, less than 10 individuals convicted. And even that, there's widespread confessions that are done under torture, and we've seen that in the case of Bhai Jagtar Singh Johal, a British national that has been incarcerated for over 8 years now as well. And inhumane torture that led to confessions. 8 years later, he's still in prison. What I'm trying to say here is that the militarization of Punjab and Kashmir, the tactics utilized on its majority Muslim or Sikh populations, the way to subdue these individuals into silence, either by militarization or by killing them, or by torturing them, or by threatening and coercing them, all those things still exist today. And when I said initially, transnational repression sometimes also extends to people in the diaspora when their family members back in Punjab or Kashmir are going to be harmed. There's a deep interlinked piece here that we have to make sure that we understand, that we are interlinked and we are connected back to the very place that we are trying to free in the first place, whether it's Punjab and Khalistan, or whether it's Kashmir, or whether there's any other community for that in the world, that they try to get to us because we have a voice sitting out here in the West, and they do it by repression of those individuals that are sitting at home, our families, our friends, our villages, and they do it in the most brutal fashion. So as we kind of move through the sessions today, that interconnectedness, that connection to Punjab, that we are facing repression in the West, why? It's not because all the activism we just do out here, it's because how this activism translates to action on the ground in Punjab or in Kashmir or anywhere else in the world. So transnational repression, while it happens in our diaspora communities, it is inherently linked back to our movement back home. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Jaswinder Singh, who will be speaking to the transnational repression in the Sikh community within the background context of what that kind of looks like now. I will actually be stepping out for a meeting. Prabjot Singh will take over for me as moderator and moving us into the second session after Jaswinder Singh is done. So Jaswinder Singh, you have the floor.
Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. We've heard already this morning about what transnational repression is and what resistance to that oppression is. Now, transnational repression occurs when governments reach beyond their own borders to intimidate, to surveil, threaten, and harm critics and dissidents living abroad. That is practically nearly everybody in this room. This practice, it violates international law, violates national sovereignty, and the fundamental human rights, those rights which are being discussed in the 61st Human Rights Session here in Geneva. So it's critical and imperative that democracies and the United Nations adopt a clear and consistent policy of zero tolerance to such actions and to rogue states such as India. When we talk about the resistance side of things, labels become very important. And for decades, the Indian government was using labels to describe Sikh resistance, Sikh self-defense as hardliners, extremists, separatists, and even militants. Those individuals were also known as freedom fighters, revolutionaries, or armed resistance in self-defense. However, post 9/11, a new term was then used to demonize and label everybody who was acting against the state's interests, and that word was terrorists. Now, if you want to shut down any democratic, political, righteous movement, all the state has to do is to deem them terrorists, and all doors and all avenues are closed to you. Now, even if you are a political lobbyist, you're an activist, you're a writer, you're a campaigner, or you're a Sikh leader, you are all tagged as the same phrase as terrorists. And in the face of that, what Sikh resistance looks like, it takes that challenge face on. Sikhs organized through the 80s, 90s, and up until today through our gurdwaras, our Sikh places of worship. They are the hub and center of Sikh organizing, and that's where we take our strength from Guru Granth Sahib Ji. It is a platform where Sikhs would share factual information and news of issues that were happening both in Punjab, across India, and in our home countries. It was a hub for community organizing, and that included sports, youth events, camps, women's activities. The Gurdwara has always been a central point for gathering, whether it's attending protests or any other event organized for other communities. It's a place of education where not only our own community, but other communities would learn about the Sikh faith and also the truths and the reality facing the people of Punjab. Regularly, you would hear challenge and combating the Indian government's state propaganda and the demonization of Sikhs. This was all done internally. Yet still rising above that and promoting the principles and ideals of the Sikh faith, of our people, but also our sovereignty. It became a center of support for the Sikh resistance, whether that was in the form of supporting Shaheed Parvars and families or political prisoners, as we've heard about. When we also extend out our activism and our response into student movements, it is important to note that the 1984 resistance led by Amrik Singh Ji Shaheed, by Harminder Singh, and many others, were all part of the Sikh Student Federation. They were all students. When you look at the names and the ages of those who gave their lives in the Battle of Amritsar, you'll be shocked to see some as young as 15, 16, 18, 21 as regular, but there was also 6 and 9-year-old girls, Bibi Satnam Kaur and Bibi Waheguru Kaur. So the student uprising has been integral to Sikh resistance throughout the ages. Even in history, we talk about Kartar Singh Sarabha and the Gaddar movement, they were all teenagers. So the Sikh student movement was also critical in the diaspora. The setting up of Sikh societies, national Sikh student bodies, all created space and platforms to have discourse and debate on issues affecting the Sikh community that were limited to purely a religious difference into a wider academia arena. It encouraged participation in grassroots Sikh activism. Many of us here have come through those channels and those networks of raising these issues 30 years ago, and we're still here in Geneva. I remember the first time I came to Geneva, it would have been, I think, in 1998, and we're still here, raising these same issues. But one thing does please me is that I'm looking towards the end of the table, and I can see very familiar and beloved faces by Harminder Singh Khalsa and by Master Singh. I met them in 1990 as while they were in a Pakistan jail. I was a very young kid. And they managed to arrive in Switzerland, and I met them at the first time, and they're still on that path. So this shows you that this is, as Dimitri said, in our DNA, and it's something that time is not bound by time or other limitations. But if we learn from our struggle, and we've talked about how transnational repression pre-Modi was designed silently to influence and put political pressure on foreign governments to either ignore or work against the interest of its own citizens. We saw that in the political lobbying of the Sikh community. Whilst we're raising issues of human rights abuses at Downing Street, whether it was pushing for the recognition of the 1984 Sikh genocide, whether it was on speaking with particular and individual parties or MPs or lords, using parliamentary mechanisms to have debates, pass motions, all of which under the guise of political lobbying, we learned in 2014 that the British government, our government, was directly involved in the attack on Sri Darbar Sahib in Operation Blue Star. Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister, authorized and sent the SAS, the UK's elite forces, to Darbar Sahib to help plan an attack, and then subsequently provided training, equipment, and setting up of the National Security Guard, the NSG, who later conducted Operation Black Thunder. But that didn't deter us. We continue to this day to lobby on the Sikhs' right to self-determination, which is a fundamental right enshrined in the UN Charter. We challenged the Indian government on the international stage, and we pushed the UK government to do so. We've used our networks and our experience now in the mainstream media. Historically, the campaign led by many of you was through Punjabi newspapers, Diaspora, Avajya and others in other countries. That moved on to the arena of television channels, live television channels, where Sikhs would have live debates, discussion, and share news, factual news from the ground in Punjab, something that had not been seen for decades. This opened the door as technology increased with social media. And that increased the range and exposure to a different audience and a wider audience. But again, that was targeted through Indian information technology laws and censorship of all social media platforms. And I can say that the Sikh Federation, in all its international forms, is openly banned and restricted on all of Meta platforms, on X, and on YouTube. This is a regular occurrence to silence the activism. We saw that with the farmers' protests, and we're going to hear more about that throughout this event. But banning hashtags, banning social media accounts, targeting those individuals behind those accounts, whether in Punjab on the ground or in the diaspora. But what we did see from that continued push and lobbying and pushing the door was that a change since the 2014 papers, it created a new interest in the Sikh movement. That actually now there was factual documented proof that India was suppressing its Sikh community in Punjab. And the British government were well aware of it, but were willing to overlook it in the interest of trade. The Westlands helicopter and other trade deals were being negotiated at the time, and that time was at the expense of your lives and the lives of your loved ones. As that coincided with the 30th anniversary of 1984, we then marked a new turn of recent transnational repression activities with the abduction and detention of British-born national Jagtar Singh Johal, who went to India in 2017 to be married, and he was abducted and has been tortured and held in Indian prison ever since. We're now over 8.5 years on. He has been acquitted in March 2025. He was acquitted of all charges, the only trial that's gone to court to date. Yet he still languishes in Indian prison, and the British government are failing to declare him arbitrarily detained and call for his immediate release, despite UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention declaring as such. We have then had the killing of Avtar Singh Khanda in 2023, and was followed 3 days later by the death and murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. All of these instances have raised the profile of Sikh activism and transnational repression. And he asked the question, why? Why are Sikhs in the diaspora being targeted? Whilst the positioning of Khalistan is changing in the media, it is now being openly discussed and debated as a Sikh right. They are now talking about a Khalistan movement, a campaign, as opposed to just simply terrorists. So the points I've raised and shared today, they leave you a question. People who have been living it for 40 years will know the answer. Those who are hearing it today, I have a question for all of you. Is that activism that we talked about, whether it's in our gurdwaras, whether it's in our student bodies, whether it's in our media, whether it's our political activism, is that terrorism? Is that something extremism? Is that what justifies transnational repression, the tactics of going into your countries and killing you while you diplomatically and politically campaign for your freedom? Because that's what we're talking about. So the question is, who really are the criminals and who really are the terror states? And that is something that we hope everyone takes away from this conference, and we start to pull the veil of the world's largest democracy, which is actually a shamocracy, and actually start to call out the actions of a rogue state in line with other countries. Thank you for your time. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So thank you to Bhai Jaswinder Singh for articulating and outlining for all of our guests here today and our attendees about the significance and the role of the diaspora in organizing and mobilizing in support of Khalistan and in support of advocating for Sikh human rights and calling for accountability against the government of India, which is fundamentally, which all of our speakers have touched on, is at the crux of why transnational repression occurs in the first place. So the first section that we just ran through right now with our first three speakers was meant to provide some background and some context around our current situation and where we are today, and why transnational repression is occurring. So we're going to move into our second session, and I'm going to open that up by actually trying to ground ourselves in the current situation and actually talking tangibly and in concrete terms about what transnational repression looks like today, why it's important, and why it's significant for us. And before I get into the details, the facts and figures that you'll be hearing from other speakers, I want to tell a very short story to get to the root of what's at stake. Why are we talking about this issue and why is it significant? So on March 24th, less than 3 weeks ago, Indian security agencies arrested a young man who's 19 years old from his home. And 12 hours later, at 4 in the morning, they announced to his family that he's dead, that he was killed in cold blood. According to the police version of events, the young man, whose name was Ranjit Singh, was arrested. He was taken from his family's home in broad daylight, in front of his family, recorded by CCTV cameras. And when he was taken into police custody, the police said that the police vehicle that was escorting him got into an accident, and this young person who was handcuffed managed to somehow escape. And according to their version of events, he ran 8 kilometers away from the scene of the accident, where he miraculously found a motorcycle and a gun on which he allegedly fired back at police officers, and he was killed in an encounter. This young man, who was never brought before a court of law, who was never charged or convicted with any crime, was killed in cold blood using this concocted story that is literally cut and paste from the story of thousands of young Sikhs since the 1980s. So when we're talking about transnational repression, we're not talking about historic grievances. We're not talking about isolated events or just vague intimidation. We're talking about a regime in one of the most populated countries in this world that is increasingly engaging in violent, volatile activities against minorities domestically in India and in Punjab in particular, as well as extrapolating and extending those repressive tentacles into the diaspora. So when we're talking about transnational repression, this isn't a theoretical conversation, and it's not just about idealism about human rights. It's fundamentally talking about one of the most populous countries in the world and one of the most significant regions geopolitically right now, effectively being subject to the whims of a Hindu nationalist government that is increasingly emboldened to target its minorities and political opponents, which is leading to increased destabilization and insecurity for that region as a whole. So when countries around the world are talking about India as a growing power or talking about its economic significance, the reality of transnational repression allows us to peer behind the curtain and actually identify and understand something about this incredibly hostile and volatile rogue actor in the international sphere that is actually contributing to undermining international order and destabilizing the political structure and social structures of the entire South Asian subcontinent. So as a lot of the other speakers have alluded to, when we talk about the reason for India's transnational repression, it fundamentally comes out of a desperation of this regime that is desperately trying to hold on to this fragile state that was artificially created as a result of British colonialism. And in particular, when we talk about the Indian state assassinating a Canadian citizen, a Sikh leader, Bhai Hardeep Singh, attempting to assassinate an American citizen, Gurpatwan Singh Pannu, assassinating a resident in the UK, Bhai Avtar Singh Khanda, as well as other figures and leadership figures in the Sikh movement, by Paramjit Singh Panjwad, by Harmeet Singh PhD, we're looking at the acts of a desperate state. That desperation is because of the renewed and resurging mobilization in support of an independent Khalistan on the ground in Punjab and in the diaspora. So when you look on the ground in Punjab, not only are we seeing increased civil disobedience, mass uprisings and protests, we're also seeing electoral parties that are openly advocating for Khalistan, that are winning elections on the ground. We're seeing increased guerrilla strikes from guerrilla organizations also targeting Indian security and intelligence infrastructure. So you're seeing this simmering discontent and conflict again at a rise because of a new generation of Sikh leadership, of activists that are coming of age and are asserting their right to self-determination and pushing this struggle forward. And when you look at the history and legacy of our region, the Sikh people have been at the helm and on the front lines of resistance against every single imperialist power, whether that was the Mughal Empire, whether that was the British colonizers, or whether it's today's current Indian state. The reason for transnational repression is because of India's sensitivity to Sikh leadership, to Sikh mobilization, and Sikh advocacy for Saravat da Pala through self-determination, through justice and dignity for all people. So in this effort where India is trying to reassert its power, its control, and asserting fear within the Sikh people, we're seeing these similarities where Punjab and the diaspora are essentially mirrors of each other. The violence and extrajudicial killings, the repression that we've seen in Punjab for the last several decades, we're seeing being now reflected in the diaspora, and the same tactics that are being used in the diaspora, particularly cognitive warfare, disinformation campaigns, and the use of organized crime to target leadership, also being mobilized and launched and pursued in Punjab itself. So when we're getting into the mechanics of transnational repression, the other speakers have talked about some of the more common mechanics, the tactics and incidents that we've seen in the last 40 years, particularly the manipulation of consular services in various countries, the denials of visas and the creation of blacklists to try and coerce and intimidate activists, the threat of violence against families back home to try and curtail political activism. And we're also seeing the clandestine operations to try and influence foreign states, foreign policy within Canada, the UK, and other countries. But because of the context we've heard from the other speakers, the last 40 years, it's the reality of impunity, the fact that these Indian operations and operatives have never had to face any consequences for their actions that are the cause for the Indian regime being increasingly emboldened to actually go out and carry out assassinations on foreign soil against Sikh leadership in multiple different countries. So if we look at the example of Canada, just where we've seen one of the most clearest articulations and the most amount of transparent public evidence on the record of how India is operating. In 2022, a number of Sikh leaders in the Lower Mainland in BC, including Bhai Hardeep Singh, received a warning from Canadian security agencies that they were facing a threat to their lives and that they're at imminent risk of assassination. For that entire year where Canadian agencies had forewarning about a potential threat, there was a massive vulnerability and a failure to transparently communicate these threats to the Sikh community publicly or to Canadians as a whole, or to actually take proactive preventative measures to provide any semblance of deterrence or prevention of any kind of violence that resulted in the assassination of Bhai Hardeep Singh in June 2023. So we've all seen what transpired in the aftermath, where the government called out the government of India and openly on the floor of Parliament talked about the evidence of Indian involvement and orchestration of the assassination on Canadian soil. But 1 year later, in 2024, Canada's National Police Service held a press conference in a way that is really unprecedented, that's never been done before. The RCMP talked about not only did the government of India engage in an assassination against Bhai Hardeep Singh, but they've been using criminal networks across Canada to orchestrate extortions, arson, multiple murders, and other forms of violence against Sikh activists and those who are vocal in support of Khalistan, but also generally targeting the entire community as a whole to create a sense of insecurity, to create a sense of fear. In that press conference and in subsequent revelations by government officials, including by Canada's Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister and Canada's National Security Advisor before a parliamentary committee, they explicitly talked about how Indian diplomats positioned in Indian consulates in Canada were openly collecting information and conducting surveillance against Sikh activists. That information was being shared in India with senior government officials, including Amit Shah, who is the second most powerful individual in India, who is the Home Affairs Minister, who then shared that information with intelligence agencies like RAW, who then directed criminal networks led by Lawrence Bishnoi, which is a prominent gangster that's actually housed in an Indian prison as his activities are being facilitated, actually carried out these ongoing criminal acts and this wave of violence that is continuing to afflict the community in Canada until today. So we're not talking in general or vague terms about this shadowy assassination. We're talking about Indian diplomats and senior government officials directing their intelligence services and criminal networks to target political dissidents, their political opponents, as well as trying to create a mass sense of insecurity and fear in the general populace in Canada. So this one incident or this one kind of case study of what we're seeing in Canada gives you some insight based on credible evidence that's on the public record from Canadian government sources about exactly how India is operating. And now if we look over the last few months, given India's supposed economic significance and strategic significance in the world, where we're seeing an increasing normalization of Canada, of the US, and of other countries with India, we're seeing these incidents and this violence slowly being swept under the rug. And India actually then using a new mechanism of transnational repression, which has also been used historically, of actually trying to manipulate mechanisms of legal cooperation to try and criminalize Sikh activists and dissidents, using narratives and manufactured allegations of extremism or terrorism to try and recruit foreign states to do their dirty work for them and engage in extradition proceedings, criminal charges, or other forms of law enforcement action to criminalize and marginalize Sikh activists on the ground. So this is the broad scope and kind of an overview of what Indian foreign interference and transnational repression activities look like around the world, not only in Canada, but in the US, in the UK, across Europe, Italy, Switzerland, Belgium, Portugal, in Australia, and in multiple other countries. This is the reality of what India is doing and how they're targeting our community leadership. So from a Sikh community perspective, the community is still firmly resolute and is continuing to actually advocate for self-determination, talking about very explicitly and unequivocally about furthering our struggle for an independent Khalistan and making sure that Indian officials are held accountable. We've gone through genocides and massacres throughout our entire history, and none of these things have ever deterred us in the past. But what's important here is for the international community to also share some of the burden and the responsibility, not only for transparency and accountability of Indian officials and the violence and the crimes that have been committed, but also more importantly to actually take concrete steps using international mechanisms that we're going to talk about in a subsequent session about preventing and stopping India's violent activities, holding officials accountable through an independent international investigation into this, and to ensure that this violence that is contributing to destabilization and increasing and escalating conflict on the ground in Punjab and elsewhere, to put a stop to that. Because as we've seen, the impunity that India has gotten and received from the international community over the past 40 years has led to it being emboldened to carry out these assassinations. And if there's no accountability, if there's no repercussions at this point, that activity is only going to continue to escalate. So I'm going to wrap up my comments here. And I'm going to pass it over to Mo Dhaliwal, who's going to talk about his own personal experiences. I've given a very kind of broad overview, almost in very technical terms, of what Indian transnational repression has looked like. So our next speakers will be focusing on their direct experiences with transnational repression, what it has looked like on them, themselves, on their families, and in their communities in general across Canada, the UK, and Europe. So I'll pass it over to Mo Dhaliwal. You have the floor.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I want to start by thanking the Baku Initiative Group, Sikh Federation International, for hosting myself and others today, and also thank the distinguished members and guests for allowing me the time to share some of my story. And there's, I think, smarter and better people than me that can speak to the geopolitics of transnational repression and what it means, and speak to the state of the Sikh community on that level. I'm really here to share a more personal story. So I'm going to start with an introduction to myself. I was born in Canada, raised in Canada. My family came to Canada in the 70s, and I wouldn't say that we were raised in a very Sikh household. We were what we sometimes refer to as a culturally Sikh family. So we were Punjabi, we were Sikh. The aspects of the culture, of the spirituality, the way of life of Sikhi that I understood then, I received through osmosis of growing up in my community and attending events, being a part of family and being a part of that community. And I share this because I think it's important to understand the context, because sometimes it's easy to understand perhaps if a particular family, a community is seen as being very staunchly and supportive of a particular type of Sikh thought or political ideology, that for that reason they might be targeted. But my story is quite different, because my family isn't one of Sikh advocacy. My family isn't one of involvement in Sikh politics. In fact, we were one of the families that very much, I think, watched and observed everything that happened, whether it was in '84 or beyond, and had some connection to it, but it was a connection that even I didn't fully understand until later in life. So growing up in Canada, I went to school there, I worked there, and my family took many trips to Punjab. And as a child, in 1990, I was pulled out of school as a young child, and we went to Punjab and spent 3.5 months there. In 1991, I was pulled out of school again for 3 months, and we spent another period of time in Punjab. So over that 2-year period, I was in Punjab for almost 7 months. And at the time, a young child wouldn't fully understand what was going on, but I could feel a shadow of fear around us. When we went out to the cities, there was always hushed tones and warnings of getting home before dark. I remember sitting in a vehicle and going through multiple checkpoints and wondering why. But the thing that really stuck with me was that during those 2 years, we would also, in, again, hushed tones, be inquiring about where my chacha was. And my chacha, my father's younger brother, my uncle, had also witnessed what happened in 1984. And him, with the personality that he had, there was an understanding that he had joined some sort of Sikh resistance. And so in 90 and 91, our family, not being one of involvement in Sikh politics or not being involved in Sikh advocacy, would go to Punjab, we would travel there, and we would ask, and we would inquire, but never too forcefully, because it was still done from this veil of fear, of understanding that if we inquired too hard, that perhaps we might also be targeted, that if we asked around too assertively, that perhaps we might get noticed. Now, I mentioned that during this period I was a young child, so I couldn't fully fear the government, the state, to the extent that my family did, because I hadn't felt that violence or seen it firsthand. But I could witness it, I could observe that my family was scared. And so in 90 and 91, those trips concluded, we went back to Canada, and my chacha was never found. And even the connection of why he was disappeared or why he was never found again was never made apparent to me by my family. It was something that I discovered on my own way later in life. Like, I was a fully grown adult, at which point I started reading more and learning more about Sikh history and about Punjab in particular. And then I had this aha moment in like my late teenage years where I said, oh my God, the reason Chacha was missing this whole time was because he'd been disappeared by the state for his connection to the Sikh insurgency at the time. And it's a little telling of the state of my family again, that again, nobody explained, nobody understood, because there was a pain of loss, and there was a instinct to almost suppress and want to forget about that moment without really delving into it. But for the most part, even once I made that connection, I carried on life in Canada as many kids do, which is you live, you get educated, you grow up, you work, and even then, Sikh politics or advocacy aren't necessarily at the forefront of your imagination. And so I continued to work and live in community, and eventually even got into doing some festivals and cultural production. And if somebody asked and said, hey, are you Indian? I would say yes, because that was the easy shortcut. It's too much to explain to try to tell somebody that, oh, I'm from a region that was annexed and here's what happened. So, oh, you're into really Indian stuff. I'd say, yes, I am into Indian stuff. And they'd say, oh, your family's Indian. I'm like, yeah, my family's Indian. I'm born in Canada, but family's Indian. And that was basically the majority of my life. And as my work grew and as I started getting more involved with the community, I eventually started this organization with a co-founder called Poetic Justice Foundation. And Poetic Justice Foundation's intent was to work on anti-racism and anti-caste initiatives in Canada. And these are both topics that we felt very, very strongly about. My partner in this organization, she's from a Dalit background, and between caste and racism, we've both been impacted by some aspects of this. So we thought this would be an interesting and a good initiative for us to start. Now, in 2020 was when this organization was founded. And later that year, many of you will remember that the farmers' protest out of India also really came into the public view. And so at that point in time, we said, we have a real connection to this community, and we have an opportunity here, so why don't we take the skills that we have, the energy and time that we're trying to put into this, and why don't we also try to help with the farmers' protest? Why don't we get involved? And again, our background wasn't Sikh advocacy or Sikh politics. So I work as a consultant. I develop strategy and work on marketing campaigns for my clients. And so at that time when we were talking, I said, we're not big Sikh activists, we're not good frontline activists, so what can we provide? Maybe what we can do is we can help the community organize. Maybe we can bring the strategic knowledge and the tools that we have to help people come together around this message and to help the wider community, media, other governments understand what's happening. Understand that the farm laws, the 3 farm laws that became so famous during that period, that they're attempting to corporatize farming, they're attempting to corporatize agriculture in India that employs 50% of that population, and to consolidate that wealth, consolidate that land transfer to corporate interests. And that is going to be bad. That is going to marginalize many millions of people, not just Punjabis, not just Sikhs. So we said, okay, we have some skills here, let's help the community get organized. And so what did I do? I put together a strategy document. I put together this PowerPoint deck, which came to be known as the toolkit. And what we did during that time was we reached out and we connected with Punjabi diaspora around the world. We first connected locally. We reached out to other communities in Canada. We reached out to the US, the UK. And within a few subsequent Zoom calls, because you'll remember it was COVID, so a lot of this work was being done remotely. Within a few Zoom calls, we had close to 100 participants representing 17 different countries on one of these organizing calls. Now, we're quite naive, speaking to myself and my partner in this organization, because we didn't grow up on the front lines of Sikh activism. And so we grew up in a democracy with certain rights and privileges, and didn't realize how naive and privileged we really were. So even when we set about creating this toolkit, this document, we worked transparently. We worked in plain sight. Our materials were publicly available. Our Zoom calls were open calls for anybody to join and invite. And we thought that there was a beauty in following what are known as open source principles in involving the community, to say we're going to do all of this in plain sight. Why? Because what we're calling for is knowledge sharing. What we're calling for is connection. What we're driven by is love for people. Why would we hide that? Even if that's written down in a document somewhere, why would we want to secretly hide that somewhere? So we were quite naive. And so we built the toolkit, we built up this document, and as the network grew, more and more partners got involved. And one of those partners was actually Greta Thunberg, internationally renowned climate activist, and her volunteer network. And this was great for us because we thought, what a great way to amplify our work and the toolkit, and we're going to help more and more people in diaspora, people that have an interest in the farm laws, even from environmental perspectives, even from anti-corporatization perspectives. We're going to be able to connect more and more people to this. We can all get involved with this. And so this network formed and got active on the distribution of the toolkit. And as a result of that, and as a result of our work, we formed a lot of connective tissue around the world. We formed connective tissue with journalists and activists in India, in Punjab. We formed connective tissue with other Sikh diaspora around the world who wanted to get involved and connect with this. And that naivety that we had, we really got punished for it, because those connections that we formed, those networks that we had so painstakingly built over the ensuing months, they were weaponized against us by the government of India. In January of 2021, shortly after Republic Day, I was very surprised one morning to start getting phone calls and messages from people that were a part of this campaign of ours, and actually from around the world. And they said, "Have you seen the news?" I said, "No, I haven't." And so we start searching online, and sure enough, my name is being presented on a number of websites, a number of media channels, from Republic TV to CNN News 18, and any variety of Indian news networks. And they had concocted this story of this international terrorist named Mo Taliwal, who was the head of this really deep, dark organization called the Poetic Justice Foundation, who was aligning American celebrities and European environmental activists to bring down the state of India, to somehow dismantle this government. And they took our toolkit and flashed it across these media channels and positioned it as being some deep, dark investigative report. Whereas, like I said, we were so naive that we built all of this in plain sight. All of this was an open source effort. All of our documents and links were on the website and posted online for anybody to look at. But once they were consumed by state-influenced media, the entire thing was framed as if it was some deep investigative report, and we were painted as terrorists. And so, aside from the ridiculousness of these claims, what actually came out of that was weeks and eventually months of a type of psychological warfare. Because for 3 weeks, my face, the face of my partner in this organization, and a number of others, our faces were blasted across the top 5 most watched news channels in India for pretty much a 24-hour news cycle for almost 3 weeks straight. And even for the months after that, our names would be invoked again and again as a reminder that these nefarious parties exist out in the world that are coordinating the collapse of India. Further to that, these networks that we had created, when I said they were weaponized against us, they had started arresting and detaining journalists and activists within India. The most famous of these was this young woman named Disha Ravi. And Disha Ravi was an environmental activist. She was on one of these Zoom calls with us because she had an environmental interest in making sure that the farm laws didn't go through. But they arrested her, and they set out to make an example of her. And she's the only example that was made famous in India. There was many others. And I think the reason why her name was brought up so much was because she was from a high caste, BJP supporting, well-to-do family. And it was almost an internal warning to people that were even government aligned, saying, watch your kids, because this could happen to them as well. There was other journalists and activists that were jailed. And in fact, the issue was taken to such an extent that there was even Supreme Court hearings in Delhi to decide whether being on a Zoom call with me as an individual accounted to sedition or not, to whether journalists and activists in India could be charged with treason against the country for having joined a Zoom call with me where the information we were sharing was about how to better connect online and how to use social media to support the farmers' protest. And so this type of psychological warfare carried on for many, many months. And what it meant was not only were these official government channels the sort of ringleaders of the attention, but it opened up the floodgates of death threats, of reminders of 1984, of pictures of our martyrs, of shaheeds being sent to myself over email, over social media. Our company channels were flooded. My staff received these threats. My clients were harassed and informed that they were working with a terrorist, and some of those clients left us, not because they believed I was a terrorist, but just because at some point the situation gets so ugly that they don't want to be a part of it, right? And who can blame them? That's well understood. So as these reminders flooded in, and as the messages flooded in saying, remember 84, we can do that again anytime, like watch your step. It took me back to being a child visiting Punjab in the 90s, because that connection that I had made so much further in life over why my chacha was disappeared, I hadn't fully absorbed that connection, because now as an adult, I understood that actually what he was doing then in the late 80s is sort of what I was doing now. And he was within their grasp, so they disappeared him. And I was far enough outside their grasp that I thought, we're safe, but we weren't safe from these sort of psychological attacks, from the disinformation and from the death threats. And so I still believed even my physical safety. I thought, well, I'm over here, what could they do to me? And we had warnings. We had people around us that were very caring and wanted to advise us well, saying, look out for your safety, make sure you don't travel alone. And I remember at the time being a little dismissive of those things, thinking, well, we're in Canada, what can they do here? And it wasn't until Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar's assassination that I realized I was continuing to be naive to how far they could reach and how deeply they could impact us. And so within the borders of Canada, our own government, our own law enforcement was pretty impotent. We reached out, we had some national media come out and talk to me and covered the story. But beyond that, there wasn't really much help, because our current mechanisms, be they political, be it media, be it technological, are just not equipped. We just don't have the frameworks in place to defend ourselves adequately. And this is only one story, right, of the nature of transnational repression and the nature of the type of coercive control that the government of India can attempt to use to influence your behavior. But frankly, growing up in Canada, it's something that we had heard about all of our lives. It was something that was culturally understood. From a young age, we knew that if you criticized the government, that they might revoke your visa, that traveling to your ancestral homeland, traveling to your spiritual birthplace, might be lost to you forever if you ever spoke up against this government. And so that had become such a cultural trope that it's mentioned quite jokingly in our circles, right? Be India de khilaf gal nahi karni, to visa nahi milna, right? Don't speak up against India, you won't get a visa. And on the one hand, you can say, Jal, it's just a small thing, it's amusing. But on the other hand, it's really interesting to look at how ingrained that fear is, that it's just understood that you have to repress yourself to an extent, lest you face exile forever. And so this highlights a type of generational trauma that I think exists actually in diaspora, where this self-censorship, this repression, is seen as good advice, right? It's our elders in our own communities would tell us to not say anything, to not speak up, to not exercise our rights living and growing in democracy, because they were trying to look out for your safety. They were trying to help, right? But we grew up hearing these things. Don't say too much, don't act too much, because you don't want to fall under their gaze. And so really the choice is now, I think for myself and others, as we look at what's happening with India and as we see the growth and the amplification of this transnational repression, is to really go to our governments, whether it's Canada, US, UK, other parts of Europe, and say, if you're a democracy and if we're your citizens, right, if we're truly your citizens, then if we have to behave in such a way that we're self-limiting, self-censoring ourselves from exercising our democratic rights, then you failed us as a government from actually creating an environment where we can safely and securely exercise those rights. And if we have an actor like India that is moving across the world, limiting people's rights who live in democracy through these forms of psychological torture or through full-on physical violence, if we have an actor like that that's moving around countries and able to coercively control those populations, then India's transnational repression moves beyond being a community problem. It's not about my story, it's not about one leader in the community or activist that was assassinated. That act of transnational repression suddenly is a threat to democracy everywhere. It's a threat to any country that upholds democratic principles and considers itself to be a safe place where people can exercise those freedoms. We're in Geneva today, and as a historically and famously neutral ground, if people even in Geneva have to watch themselves, limit who they're seen with, limit their voices, then India's transnational repression has succeeded even here. And that's when the governments of the world have to come together and look at this country and say, what frameworks, what can we put in place to ensure that people that are outside the physical grasp, at least, of India, can exercise their rights, can continue to live their lives, and grow and flourish in the spaces that they're in. Because as it stands, again, my story is just one, but I know there's dozens around me that would never say anything. And there's probably hundreds more that I don't even know about, right? I'm just talking about my own family. There are literally dozens of people that will never say anything. They know everything that's going on with India. They know everything about our people that are being brutalized in Punjab. And they won't utter a peep because they fear exile, they fear psychological torture, they fear physical attack. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mo, for sharing the comments and your own experience. And I think I can speak for many of the other young Sikhs in the room when I say that that personal arc, I think, of connecting your experience from your visits to Punjab in the 1990s, those hushed tones, those trying to find out what happened to your chacha, is something that a lot of us have experienced in different ways. And I think your entire arc of connecting it back to then becoming a target of transnational repression yourself is something that I think in different ways, again, our generation has come to see in very vivid and concrete terms. And I think that experience of being constantly told not to talk about these issues, I think is very relatable. When I think about myself, growing up in Canada, being about 13, 14 years old, asking questions about 1984, mentioning the word Khalistan, and at that time already, right off the bat, being warned by friends and family members, don't talk about this. You're not going to get a visa. You're going to be targeted. And I think, so next I'm going to ask Harmeer Kaur to say a few words to talk about the experience of transnational repression that's been faced by the Sikh community across Europe, and to say a few words about what those operations, that targeting and that violence has looked like, particularly through the vantage point of the Sikh diaspora in various countries across Europe.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Zuerst möchte ich der Baku Group herzlich danken, dass sie diese wichtige Konferenz organisiert haben und jungen Menschen wie mir die Möglichkeit geben, heute hier zu sprechen. In der Sikh-Tradition hat Guru Gobind Singh Ji ein wichtiges Prinzip gelehrt. Manes ki jaat sabe ekke pehchanbo. Erkenne die gesamte Menschheit als eine Einheit. Diese Worte erinnern uns daran, dass jeder Mensch Würde, Sicherheit und Gerechtigkeit verdient. Doch heute möchte ich eine einfache Frage stellen. Was passiert, wenn Regierungen versuchen, ihre Kritiker sogar über ihre eigenen Landesgrenzen hinaus zum Schweigen zu bringen? Genau das nennen wir transnationale Repression. Viele Menschen denken, dass dieses Problem nur in Ländern wie dem Vereinigten Königreich oder den Vereinigten Staaten oder in Kanada existiert. Doch es passiert auch hier in Europa. Einer der frühesten bekannten Fälle in Europa war die Ermordung von Bhai Jakhvinder Singh. Er wurde an seinem Arbeitsplatz von einem maskierten Angreifer durch einen Kopfschuss getötet. Das geschah am 17. April 2007 in Belgien. Bis heute ist dieser Fall nicht aufgeklärt. In vielen europäischen Ländern gibt es Personen, die Informationen über Sikh-Aktivisten sammeln und diese an ihre Auftraggeber im Ausland weitergeben. Einige Staaten haben diese Bedrohung ernst genommen, zum Beispiel Deutschland. Deutschland hat zum Beispiel klare Maßnahmen gegen Personen ergriffen, die Sikh-Aktivisten ausspionieren. Und wir hoffen, dass auch andere Länder ihre Gemeinschaften besser vor solchen Einschüchterungen schützen. In den letzten Jahren gab es weitere ernste Vorfälle. Nach der Ermordung von Avtar Singh Kanda im Vereinigten Königreich und Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Kanada sind die Sorgen über transnationale Repression weltweit gewachsen. In Italien wurden Berichten zufolge Anschlagspläne gegen Sikh-Aktivisten verhindert. Es gab auch einen Anschlagversuch auf Herrn Ranjit Singh, der derzeit untersucht wird. Gleichzeitig wurden falsche Anschuldigungen verbreitet, um die Geschäfte von Herrn Gurjinder Singh und Ranjit Singh zu schädigen. Und diese Vorwürfe haben sich später als unwahr herausgestellt. In einigen Fällen wurden Geheimdienstmitarbeiter, die mit RA, dem indischen Auslandgeheimdienst, verbunden sind, still aus europäischen Ländern ausgewiesen. Oft wird jedoch nicht öffentlich erklärt, warum diese Personen ausgewiesen wurden. Doch Transparenz ist wichtig, wenn wir Einschüchterung verhindern und Gemeinschaften schützen wollen. Zum Schluss möchte ich einen Fall aus der Schweiz erwähnen. Ein indischer Agent hat Schweizer Sikhs überwacht, indem er Informationen über sie sammelte. Er hat sogar meinen Vater angegriffen, einer der bekanntesten Schweizer Sikhs, der nach 1984 ins Visier der indischen Behörden geraten war. Für viele Menschen klingt transnationale Repression vielleicht wie ein entferntes politisches Thema, doch für manche Familien, auch für meine eigene, ist es etwas sehr Reales. Das zeigt, dass transnationale Repression nicht nur in Nordamerika geschieht, sondern auch hier in Europa. Wie ich am Anfang erwähnte, lehrte Guru Gobind Singh Ji uns, Manas ki jaat sab ek pehchanbo. Erkenne die gesamte Menschheit als eine Einheit. Wenn wir wirklich an dieses Prinzip glauben, dürfen wir nicht schweigen, wenn Unrecht geschieht. Wir müssen darüber sprechen, wir müssen für Gerechtigkeit einsehen und wir müssen die Würde und Sicherheit jedes Menschen schützen. Vielen Dank. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you to Harmeer Kaur for sharing those details and that experience of the Sikh community across Europe and for sharing.
By Avtar Singh Kanda in some capacity, and nearly everybody will know the contributions of his father for the Sikh struggle. Never did we think that the photos of the Shaheed Singhs adorn our Gurdwara across the UK and our home would fall on a very close friend of ours, somebody who was younger than me. And the sudden nature of the death of Avtar Singh Kanda, if you take it in isolation, as both the Indian state or the British government have done, it looks like a death of natural causes. And that's what the line has been to date by the British government. But actually, it's when you look deeper into the conspiracy, the planning, the execution of India's long thought out transnational repression activities, it becomes a lot more sinister. But the case of Avtar Singh Kanda started long before his ultimate demise. You've heard about the pre and post Modi. In 2014, when Modi came to power, he got his agencies, his intelligence groups abroad to focus on the diaspora. Ahead of his visit to the UK in 2015, a dossier was issued and handed to UK Parliament. In that dossier was a lot of fabricated information, a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation, but specifically Avtar Singh Kanda was named in that dossier as an individual who was recruiting and setting up terror cells in the UK. But then things got more serious as activism in Punjab reawoken. The aftermath of the farmers' protest that you heard about from Maninder Dhaliwal, that led to huge protests outside of Punjab. And it reawoken a self-existence and the struggle to maintain your future within the youth of Punjab. That was galvanized and led by Deep Sidhu, who was a lawyer and an Indian actor and became the prominent face of the farmers' protest. He was a personal friend of Avtar, and together they set up the Varis Punjab, their youth group. After the sudden death of Deep Singh, which is again under very suspicious circumstances, in February 2022, by Amritpal Singh, who is now an elected member of the Indian Parliament, but yet still resides in Dibrugarh prison in Assam, took the lead of the Varis Punjab Day, a mass unified youth movement which was encouraging the youth to leave alcohol, leave substance abuse, leave drugs, and follow the path of their faith and our gurus. He also challenged the rise of the far-right Hindutva agenda, which was swaying across India, that actually if the Home Secretary of a government can openly call for Hindu Rashtra, then why is it offensive and why is it terrorism if a Sikh has an aspiration for Khalistan, which is a Sikh-led homeland for themselves? Under that pressure and state repression, the Indian police launched an operation in March 2023, which was to lock off Punjab, turn it once again into a concentration camp, and flooded 90,000 police officers to apprehend a few individuals. He evaded their capture and remained underground for 4 weeks. Now that incident is critical because the Indian government and the Indian police began a campaign of targeted harassment of not only Avtar Singh Kanda, but also his family. He was portrayed as enemy of the state across all of the Indian media for organizing and damaging the Indian embassy in London, an event that he was not even present at. But that was the truth, or the facts were not necessary for the Indian narrative. What they needed to paint was Avtar Singh Kanda, known son of a Sikh militant, known activist in the UK, and organizer of an attack on the Indian embassy. That then triggered a whole wave of targeting harassment of Avtar, put him in the center of all known gangs or affiliates to the Indian government who would deem it patriotic to take out Avtar Singh Kanda. Yet, despite all of this, Avtar continued with his activism and attended the 1984 rally for the 1984 Remembrance March and Rally in Trafalgar Square in London, where we had nearly 20,000 people from the UK attend. Avtar was absolutely fine. I spent hours with him. We were talking about future plans, what we would need to do in Punjab for the youth, what we needed to do here, and we spent the day talking about the event, our history, and our future. A week later, Avtar was admitted into hospital with some pains. Once he was admitted into hospital, they diagnosed him with acute myeloid leukemia, a form of blood cancer, and that he had blood clots. The doctors, whilst it was a serious diagnosis, were not concerned in terms of his life threat. A day and a half later, Avtar Singh was pronounced dead on the 15th of June 2023. 3 days he spent in hospital after going in absolutely fine. Never had been to a doctor, never had any medical preconditions. Now, on the face of it, whilst it was shocking, Yet still, there was a massive view or belief that the Indian government had come to the UK and killed a UK resident, especially not someone as high profile. But the days that followed started to turn that opinion. 3 days later, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was killed, and we all know the circumstances around that. But it's what the UK government did. The India were claiming that they'd done it, they'd killed Avtar, they'd kill Hardeep, and they were celebrating in their typical fashion. But it's what the UK government did or failed to do, which rose suspicion beyond belief. It is routine when anyone dies of cancer to do an autopsy and a post-mortem. It is mandatory, you would have thought, and duty-bound for any doctor or coroner to do an autopsy when someone dies at the age of 35 with no previous medical conditions and dies within 3 days of going into hospital. The autopsy and post-mortem was refused. One was requested by the family, that was refused. Repeated requests were refused. The West Midlands Police, who were reported this, who received reports of this as a crime, refused to investigate it. Yet they went out publicly and said, we've done a thorough and deep investigation into the death of Avtar and found no suspicious circumstances, despite not interviewing any of his friends, his family, not tracking his phones, not tracking his laptop, not even searching his property. That was later called out when we met with the West Midlands Police Chief Constable as a complete failed and irrelevant investigation. It is normal practice if you want to pursue a private autopsy that you can get your own pathologist and conduct that. We were instructed as such by the coroner. One was sought by the community and the family, and the hospital refused to give access to Kunda's body to the private pathologist. They refused access to the medical facility in which to perform the autopsy. Highly irregular and unheard of in this case, in any case. What they then did to cement the cover-up, that Avtar's body was then moved into a freezer. So that would deteriorate the body and prolong any subsequent private autopsy that the family would wish to organize. Given now that it was 5 weeks since Avtar had passed away, the body was deteriorating and there was huge pressure put on the family and the community to complete his funeral and cremation, which would have clearly removed any evidence of any wrongdoing. The government manipulated and effectively emotionally blackmailed the family into accepting the death certificate with the lure of a visa for Avtar's mum and his sister to attend the funeral, which they later denied and refused. The level of complicity did not end there of the UK government. Once Justin Trudeau in September stood up and announced that actors of the Indian government were directly involved in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, it sent shockwaves around the world. People in corridors were talking that the killing of Avtar was also very suspicious. British intelligence were highly suspicious of the death of Avtar Singh Kanda, and it was known that it was not from natural causes. A lawyer was hired by the family, Michael Pollock, who requested a full inquest into Avtar's death, and those requests are ongoing today and have been refused not only by the coroner but the UK government. So what this has highlighted is that there was a long-standing plan by the Indian government to take out and target and assassinate Sikh activists. It didn't end with Avtar. 20 others were put on a hit list, 6 of whom were from the UK. The NIA targeted protesters. This all happened under the nose of the British government. And what really, I guess, was the final nail in the coffin, so what we know to date, is that actually the intelligence that the Canadian government received on the killing of Avtar Singh Nijjar, connecting the Indian government, was actually intercepted by the British intelligence. So they intercepted those calls, they shared that with the Canadians. It was so sensitive and classified that they flew over in person to give those documents. So if the British government knew that Avtar was being targeted, They knew his life was at risk. They knew he'd been killed. They did everything in their power to cover up that this would never come out. That's the level and extent of not only India's transnational repression activities, how it affects us all, but the influence and pressure they can place on foreign governments, some of the biggest superpowers in the world, to stay quiet and help them cover up. And we're seeing similar things in Canada, but that's the extent of what one individual, how he can rock the system. But his legacy and his truth will live on. And as we have been fighting for justice and the truth from 1984 for 42 years, we'll continue the struggle to ensure that Avtar's truth is unveiled of what happened to him, and the actions of the Indian government around transnational repression and targeting other Sikh activists is stopped in its tracks. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you to Bhai Jaswinder Singh for sharing those details. I think it's incredibly important to actually break down what transpired from the point of Bhai Avtar Singh's killing all the way up until now, and the lack of any kind of transparency and accountability, which has been to this point one of the biggest faults and one of the biggest problems of the response to transnational repression over the past 40 years, is that it has gone almost entirely unacknowledged until it came to a point where there are brazen assassinations in countries around the world. But unfortunately, even despite those alarming and egregious violations, we still have individual countries who are choosing to prioritize their economic or strategic priorities in terms of furthering their own foreign policy, rather than actually ensuring that they take meaningful steps towards transparency and actually holding those officials to account that perpetrated that very violence. So I'm going to now hand it back to Bhai Maninder Singh to take us into the third session today, which is exactly on this very topic about, from the community's perspective of those who have the lived experience of surviving and enduring these threats and violence, what the expectations and recommendations are for the international community, whether that's various host countries and these states that are being targeted by India, or whether we're talking about international institutions like the UN Human Rights Council, and other bodies as well. So I'll hand it over to Bhai Maninder Singh to take us to that next session.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Earlier I spoke to the concept of Sarvata Bhala, which is the welfare of all globally, and that we're a global family per se within the Khalsa traditions. And one of the ways to show that solidarity sometimes is to acknowledge a people's plight, their struggle, their right to sovereignty. And I would be remiss to say that we have partners in this room that are from around the world, and I want to touch on even the plight of people that are around us and sometimes we don't know. And I've had the opportunity to meet some brilliant people in Geneva, one of them being in this room right now. And I do want to acknowledge, just for our people here and for what we'll be using on social media, that we have to acknowledge the genocide of people all around the world. In 2009, the Sri Lankan army committed one of the most heinous genocides in recent memory, murdering more than 150,000 Tamil people over just a period of a few months. Scholars describe the events of 2009 as the climax of the genocidal process against the Tamil people. I think when we look at these types of situations, we're not talking years, we're not talking decades, we're not talking centuries, we're talking about over a period of a few months, the Sri Lankan army committing a mass genocide of over 150,000 Tamil people as they moved for their sovereignty, to determine their own destiny, and for the betterment of their children and their future generations. We can draw parallels and solidarity with these movements. We have partners and friends and brothers and sisters from across the world that we can lean on. Many times when countries turn their faces from us, it's these very people that are the ones that hold your hand and actually guide you through processes that you maybe are not aware of, and they teach you and you get to learn from them as well. The solidarity between people that are striving for sovereignty is sometimes much stronger and much more, I would say, honest and pure than nation-state interests sometimes. And I think that is something we wanted to acknowledge today as well, that we had partners that attended from many communities, and we want to acknowledge them here, not only their suffering, but their resolve and their resilience. We're here not only to talk about the genocide of the Sikh people or the Tamil people or the Kashmiri people, we're talking about the resilience of those people. Transnational repression and genocide can come in many forms, but the fact that people will exist, people will fight back, people will find a way to pass this on to their future generations so their struggle doesn't end. That is the true resilience of like the human spirit at the end of the day, and that's what bonds all of us together. So I wanted to make that acknowledgement that we are here in Geneva during the 61st session of the Human Rights Council that's sitting just a few hundred meters away, and there's mass conversations that are happening in rooms like this all around the world about the plight of a people trying to determine their own destiny, whether they're Tamil people or Sikh people or Kashmiri people or anyone for that matter. But the right to self-determination and the right to determine your own destiny is a fundamental fact that we all agree on, and that's where our solidarity begins. And hopefully in the near future, all of these communities will find peace, will find freedom, and will have homes of their own where they can determine their own destiny. Now in Punjabi, I wanted to add a few things before I turn it over to the final session. कि अपनी गल जिहड़ी है साडे लई निशाना जिहड़ा है साडा जिहड़ा तय करना बहुत जरूरी है कि साडा निशाना स्पष्ट होना चाहिए। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਾਡਾ ਵੈਰੀ ਆ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਦੇ ਰੂਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਿਸ਼ਾਨਾ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਸਪਸ਼ਟ ਆ। ਕਈ ਵਾਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਦੋ ਹੀ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਆ ਜਦੋਂ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਵੱਲ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਆ, ਜਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਸਾਡਾ ਪੂਰਨ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਖਾਤਮਾ, ਸਾਡਾ ਅਨਾਇਲੇਸ਼ਨ, ਜਾਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਹਿੰਦੂਤਵਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਦੇ ਫੋਲਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਿਆਣ ਕੇ ਬੇਸਿਕਲੀ ਇੰਨੀ ਮਿਲਾਵਟ ਸਾਡੇ ਧਰਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਾ ਦੇਣੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਕਿਤੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੇਸਾਧਾਰੀ ਹਿੰਦੂ ਹੀ ਰਹਿ ਜਾਣਾ। ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਾਡੀ ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਆ ਉਹ ਜਨਾਊ ਬਣ ਜਾਣੀ ਆ, ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੇਸ ਆ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਯੋਗੀ ਆ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹੇ ਬਣ ਜਾਣਾ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਗੋਲ ਤਾਂ ਇਹੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਚੁੱਪ ਕਰਾਉਣਾ ਆ, ਜਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਖਾਤਮਾ ਕਰਕੇ ਸਰੀਰਕ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਤੋਂ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਇਆ, ਜਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੇਂਦਰਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਅਕਾਲ ਤਖਤ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਸ਼੍ਰੋਮਣੀ ਕਮੇਟੀ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਸੰਪਰਦਾਵਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਸਰਬੱਤ ਖਾਲਸੇ ਦੇ ਇੱਕ ਮਹਾਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਾਡਾ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਗਵਰਨੈਂਸ ਮਾਡਲ ਹੈ, ਉੱਥੇ ਤੱਕ ਕਿਤੇ ਕਿਤੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਾਵਟਾਂ ਆ ਗਈਆਂ। ਇਹ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇੱਕ ਪਰਪਸਫੁਲ ਤਰੀਕੇਕਾਰ ਇੱਕ ਚਾਲ ਆ। ਇਹਨੂੰ ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਕੱਲੇ ਸਾਇਲੋ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਸਾਡੀ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸਕ ਭੁੱਲ ਹੋਊਗੀ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਵੈਰੀ ਨੂੰ ਪਛਾਣ ਨਾ ਸਕੇ, ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਚੁੱਪ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਚੁੱਪ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਉਣੀ ਆ। ਜਦੋਂ ਸਿੱਖ ਚੁੱਪ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਸਿੱਖ ਦਾ ਜ਼ਮੀਰ ਮਰ ਗਿਆ, ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਸੰਤ ਜੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ ਕਿ ਸਿੱਖ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਜ਼ਮੀਰ ਮਰਨਾ ਉਹੀ ਯਕੀਨਨ ਮੌਤ ਆ, ਸਰੀਰ ਦਾ ਮਰਨਾ ਤਾਂ ਉਹ ਤਾਂ ਬੰਦੇ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ। ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਆ ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਇਕੱਤਰ ਵੀ ਹੋਏ ਆ, ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਕ ਰੂਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਦੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਅਤੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਕਿ ਆਉਣ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਫਾਇਦਾ ਆ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਲ ਲਈ ਇੱਥੇ ਜਨੀਵਾ ਆਉਣ ਨੂੰ 2-3 ਸਾਲ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਆ। ਕਈ ਇੱਥੇ ਸਿੰਘ ਸਿੰਘਣੀਆਂ ਬੈਠੇ ਹੋਣੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਕਈ ਦਹਾਕਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਰਹੇ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਵੱਲ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਆ ਕਿ 40-40 ਸਾਲ ਬੰਦੇ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਤੁਰੇ ਰਹੇ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਹਾਲੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਵਰਗੇ ਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ 15-20 ਸਾਲ ਮਸੀਹ ਹੋਏ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਨੌਜਵਾਨ ਨਾਲ ਆਏ ਆ ਇਹ ਤੁਰੇ ਆ, ਪਰ ਇਹ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਵੱਲ ਦੇਖ ਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਵੱਲ ਦੇਖ ਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਰੇ ਹਾਂ। ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬੰਦੇ ਦ੍ਰਿੜਤਾ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਸੇ ਲਾਈਨ 'ਤੇ ਰਹੇ ਆ, ਬਹੁਤ ਜਾਣੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਆਲੇ ਦੁਆਲੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਾਣਦੇ ਪਛਾਣਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਟੁੱਟ ਗਏ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੁੜ ਕੇ ਦਿੱਲੀ ਨੂੰ ਵਾਪਸ ਚਲੇ ਗਏ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਤੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਸਮਝੌਤੇ ਕਰ ਲਏ। ਹੁਣ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਪੰਥਕ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਰੋਲ ਮਾਡਲਸ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਸਾਡੇ ਪੰਥਕ ਸਪੇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ, ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਸਿਆਣੇ ਸਿੰਘ ਬੈਠੇ ਆ, ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਰੋਲ ਮਾਡਲ ਸੀ। ਸਾਡੀ ਖੁਆਇਸ਼ ਇਹੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ ਇੰਨੀ ਕੁ ਸਾਡੇ ਕਿਤੇ ਬਖਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਰੱਖੇ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਡੋਲੀਏ ਨਾ, ਅਤੇ ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਵੀ 20-30 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਸੇ ਲਾਈਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਰਹੇ ਅਤੇ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜਨਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਅਸੀਂ ਐਟਲੀਸਟ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਰੋਲ ਮਾਡਲ ਬਣਾਉਣ ਦੇ ਕਾਬਲ ਬਣੀਏ। ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਏ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਤਾ ਸੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਕਿਹਨੇ ਆਉਣਾ, ਕੀ ਹੋਣਾ ਜਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਣਾ, ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕੁਝ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਦੱਸ ਸਕਦਾ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਜੋ ਵੱਡੇ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਆਲਰੇਡੀ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਚਰਚਾ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਜਨੀਵਾ 'ਚ ਕੀ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਆ, ਸਿੱਖ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਬੈਠੇ ਆ, ਇਕੱਤਰ ਹੋਏ ਆ, ਇਹ ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਮੀਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਆਲਰੇਡੀ ਰੌਲੀ ਪੈ ਗਈ ਆ ਸਵੇਰ ਦੀ। ਕੁਝ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਵੱਲੋਂ, ਕੁਝ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਹੀ ਲੋਕ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਚੀਜ਼ ਨੂੰ ਪਸੰਦ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਣ ਕੇ ਉਹ ਬੜੇ ਇੱਕ ਜਹਿਦ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਖੁਸ਼ ਆ, ਐਕਸਾਈਟਡ ਆ ਕਿ ਕੁਛ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਆ। ਆਪਣੇ ਕੋਲ ਇੱਥੇ ਇਸ ਕਮਰੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਹੋਰ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀਜ਼ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਆਪਣੀ ਲੜਾਈ ਲੜ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਪਹੁੰਚੇ ਆ। ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੀਡੀਆ ਆ, ਮੇਜਰ ਮੀਡੀਆ ਨੈਟਵਰਕਸ ਜਰਮਨੀ ਤੋਂ, ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਤੋਂ, ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦਾ ਮੀਡੀਆ ਆਨਲਾਈਨ ਆ, ਉਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਇੱਥੇ ਮੌਜੂਦ ਆ। ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਮੀਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਆ ਆਲਰੇਡੀ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਬਹੁਤ ਤੇਜ਼ੀ ਨਾਲ ਆਲਰੇਡੀ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, ਅਤੇ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਡੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਮੇਵਾਰੀ ਬਣਨੀ ਹੈ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਪੈਕੇਜ ਕਰਕੇ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਲਾ ਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਮੂਹਰੇ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕਰੀਏ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਕੀ ਕਰਕੇ ਆਏ ਹਾਂ। ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਜਨਰਲ ਅਸੈਂਬਲੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਸੀਂ ਬੋਲ ਕੇ ਆਏ ਹਾਂ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ, ਅਤੇ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉੱਥੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਮੌਜੂਦ ਸੀਗੇ ਕਿ ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਦੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਜਨਰਲ ਡਿਬੇਟ ਆਈਟਮ ਨੰਬਰ 3 ਦੇ ਥੱਲੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਭਾਈ ਰਣਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਜਿਹੜਾ 19 ਸਾਲ ਦਾ ਨੌਜਵਾਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਫੇਕ ਐਨਕਾਊਂਟਰ 'ਚ ਮਾਰਿਆ ਉਹਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਕੇ ਆਏ। UAPA ਥੱਲੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬੰਦੀ ਸਿੰਘ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਕੇ ਆਏ, ਅੰਮ੍ਰਿਤਪਾਲ ਸਿੰਘ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਕੇ ਆਏ, ਜੱਗੀ ਜੌਹਲ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਕੇ ਆਏ। ਇਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੁਛ ਇਕੱਤਰ ਹੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਤਾਂ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਕੱਠਾ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੁਛ ਹੋਵੇ। ਨਾਲ ਹੁਣੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਮੈਂ ਥੱਲੇ ਗਿਆ ਸੀਗਾ, ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦਾ ਪਰਮਾਨੈਂਟ ਮਿਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਡੈਪੂਟੀ ਡਾਇਰੈਕਟਰ ਥੱਲੇ ਆਈ ਸੀ ਮਿਲਣ ਲਈ। ਅਸੀਂ ਕੁਝ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਸਿੰਘ ਸੀਗੇ ਬਾਲਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਨੂੰ ਨਾ ਬਾਦਰ ਕਰੀਏ, ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਮੀਟਿੰਗ ਕਰਕੇ ਆਏ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ 2 ਵੱਡੀਆਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਹੋਈਆਂ। ਇੱਕ ਸੀਗਾ ਕਿ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਕਿ ਉਹਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਐਗਜ਼ਿਸਟਿੰਗ ਵਰਕਿੰਗ ਗਰੁੱਪਸ ਆ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਐਜ਼ ਅ ਸੈਪਰੇਟ ਆਈਟਮ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਕਿਤੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਿਆਂਦਾ ਜਾਵੇ ਅਤੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੀ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਲੈਣੀ। ਦੂਜੀ ਗੱਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਵੱਡੀ ਸੀ, ਆਈ ਥਿੰਕ ਧਾਰਮਿਕ ਪਰਸਪੈਕਟਿਵ ਤੋਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਦੀ ਅਕੋਮੋਡੇਸ਼ਨ ਯੂਨਾਈਟਿਡ ਨੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਫਾਈਨਲ ਕਰਨਾ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਸਾਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਕਿ ਉਹਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਸੈਸ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਪੁਸ਼ ਕਰਨਾ ਆ। ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਹਮਾਇਤ ਵੀ ਮਿਲੀ ਹੈ। ਹੋਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਆ ਅਗਲੇ ਹਫ਼ਤੇ ਭਾਈ ਦਵਿੰਦਰਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ, ਮੈਂ, ਹੋਰ ਸਿੰਘਾਂ ਨੇ UK ਦਾ ਪਰਮਾਨੈਂਟ ਮਿਸ਼ਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਜਨੀਵਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਣਾ ਇਸੇ ਮੁੱਦਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ। ਆਪਾਂ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਕਰੀਏ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹਾ ਥਾਂ ਮੰਨਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਘੱਟ ਗਿਣਤੀ ਲੋਕ, ਕੁਚਲੇ ਹੋਏ ਲੋਕ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਲੋਕ ਜੈਨੋਸਾਈਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਲੰਘੇ ਆ, ਜੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਰਗੇ ਬੰਦੇ, ਸਾਡੀ ਕੌਮ ਦੇ ਨੌਜਵਾਨ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਅੰਦਰ ਇੱਕ ਪੈਰ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਰੱਖ ਸਕਦੇ ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਦੇ ਮਸਲੇ ਕਰਕੇ, ਫਿਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਦਰਵਾਜ਼ਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਮਾਈਨੋਰਿਟੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਮੂੰਹ 'ਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬੰਦ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਆ। ਜਿਸ ਕਾਰਨ ਇਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਯੂਨਾਈਟਿਡ ਨੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਬਣਿਆ ਸੀ, ਬੇਸਿਕਲੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਸੇ ਚੀਜ਼ ਦੀ ਉਲੰਘਣਾ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਆ। ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਰਹੇ ਆ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਮਕਾਉਣ 'ਤੇ ਤੁਲੇ ਹੋਏ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਅੰਦਰ ਸੀਟਾਂ ਦਿੱਤੀਆਂ ਆ। ਅਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀਜ਼ ਦੀ ਅਕੋਮੋਡੇਸ਼ਨ ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਦੀ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਏਅਰਪਲੇਨਸ 'ਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਪਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਕੋਰਟ ਹਾਊਸਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, UK ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਕੋਮੋਡੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਆ। ਸੋ ਕਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਕਾਰਨ ਆ ਕਿ ਯੂਨਾਈਟਿਡ ਨੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿੱਖ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਉਹ ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ, ਅਤੇ ਪੂਰੀ ਹਮਾਇਤ ਮਿਲੀ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਪਰਮਾਨੈਂਟ ਮਿਸ਼ਨ ਤੋਂ। ਆਸ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਆ ਕਿ UK ਤੋਂ ਵੀ ਮਿਲਣੇ ਆ। 3 ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲ ਰੈਪਰਟਰਸ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਛਲੇ 2 ਹਫ਼ਤਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਿੰਘਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਣ ਦਾ ਮੌਕਾ ਮਿਲਿਆ। ਹਿਊਮਨ ਰਾਈਟਸ ਡਿਫੈਂਡਰਸ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲ ਰੈਪਰਟਰ ਮੈਰੀ ਲਾਲਰ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧੀਆ ਹੋਈ, ਅਤੇ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ 'ਤੇ ਰੈਡੀ ਹੈ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਦਾ ਮਸਲਾ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਆ, ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਸ ਮਸਲੇ 'ਤੇ ਖੜੂਗੇ। ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਈ ਬੰਦੇ ਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦੀ ਕਿ ਛੋਟੀ ਹੈ, ਬਸ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਮਨ 'ਤੇ ਪੱਥਰ ਰੱਖ ਕੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਜਾਣਾ ਪੈਂਦਾ ਆ। ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੋਈ ਅੰਮ੍ਰਿਤਧਾਰੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਆ, ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਆਪਣੀ ਲਾਉਣੀ ਜਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਛੋਟੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਗੱਲ 'ਚ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਪਾਉਣੀ, ਉਹ ਗੱਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਬੰਦਾ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਕਰਦਾ ਆ ਕਿ ਲੱਗਾ ਸੀ ਕੋਈ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਇੱਥੇ ਗੁਰੂ ਨਾਲ ਵਿਦਾਵਾ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ। ਬਟ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਤਾਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਦੱਸਣੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਸਿਰਫ ਇੱਕ ਮਕਸਦ ਲਈ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਏ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਸਿਰਫ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ ਕਰਨਾ, ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੋਲੀਡੈਰਿਟੀ ਬਿਲਡ ਕਰਨੀ ਸੀ, ਮੀਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਅਟੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਉਣਾ ਸੀ, ਯੂਨਾਈਟਿਡ ਨੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਦੀ ਜਨਰਲ ਅਸੈਂਬਲੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਣਾ ਸੀ, ਅਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਾਲ ਆਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮਸਲੇ ਸਾਈਡ 'ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉੱਭਰ ਕੇ ਬਾਹਰ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਿਤੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਕੋਈ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਰਣਨੀਤੀ ਤਿਆਰ ਕਰਕੇ ਅੱਗੇ ਤੋਰਨੀ ਸੀ। ਸੋ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਉਣ ਦਾ ਤਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਲਾਭ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਇਹ ਆ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਚਲੋ ਇਕੱਤਰਤਾ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਲੀਡਰਸ਼ਿਪ ਦੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ। ਦੂਜਾ ਆ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਕੁਛ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਪ੍ਰਮੋਟ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਜਿੰਨਾ ਉਤਸ਼ਾਹ ਬਾਕੂ ਤੋਂ ਜਾਣ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਇਆ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਦੁੱਗਣਾ ਤਿੱਗਣਾ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਹੁਣ ਸਾਡੇ ਜ਼ਿੰਮੇਵਾਰੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਬਾਹਰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾਈਏ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਸਿਰਫ ਇੱਕ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ। ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਖਤਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਈ, ਇਹ ਐਸੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ ਤੋਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਨੀਵਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੈਠ ਕੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਇਕੱਤਰ ਹੋਏ ਆ ਅਤੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਰਣਨੀਤੀ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਸਾਲ, 2 ਸਾਲ, 5 ਸਾਲ ਲਈ ਤਿਆਰ ਕਰਕੇ ਗਏ ਆ। ਸੋ ਇੰਨੀ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਸੀਗੀ ਕਿ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਸੀਗਾ ਕਿ ਚਲੋ ਹੁਣ ਆਪਾਂ ਹੀ ਬੈਠੇ ਹਾਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸਾਰੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਭਰਾ ਭੈਣ, ਸੋ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਸੀਗਾ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਫਾਇਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀ ਗੱਲ ਸਮਝਾਉਣ ਦਾ ਤਾਂ ਮਕਸਦ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਕਦੀ ਕਦੀ ਦੂਰੋਂ ਨੇੜਿਓਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆਏ ਆ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕੁਝ ਪੀਸਿਸ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੀ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ। ਅੱਜ ਪਿਛਲੇ 2 ਹਫ਼ਤਿਆਂ ਲਈ ਭਾਈ ਦਵਿੰਦਰਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਹੁਣੀ, ਪ੍ਰਭਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਹੁਣੀ, ਜਸਵਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਹੁਣੀ, ਮੈਂ, ਅਸੀਂ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ 'ਤੇ ਤਤਪਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਸ਼ੁਰੂਆਤ ਕਰੀਏ ਕਿ 2-3 ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਅਚੀਵੇਬਲ ਆ। ਕਿਰਪਾਨ ਦਾ ਮਸਲਾ ਅਚੀਵੇਬਲ ਆ ਸ਼ੋਰਟ ਟਰਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ, ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਜਿੱਤ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਹਾਸਲ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ। ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਮਸਲਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਨਹੀਂ। ਜਿੰਨਾ ਚਿਰ ਸਿੱਖ ਆਪਣੀ ਆਵਾਜ਼ ਉਠਾਉਂਦੇ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਚਿਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਖਤਮ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਆਉਣਾ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਮਿਥ ਕੇ ਤੁਰੇ ਹੀ ਆਲਰੇਡੀ ਸਾਰੇ ਜਾਣੇ। ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਿਰਫ ਜਦੋਂ ਮੈਂ ਗੱਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ ਉੱਥੇ ਮੈਂ ਮੁਕੰਮਲ ਕਰਦਾ ਅਤੇ ਲਾਸਟ ਸੈਸ਼ਨ 'ਚ ਚਲੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਨਿਸ਼ਾਨਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਉਹ ਕਦੀ ਕਦੀ ਘੱਲੂਘਾਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਹੀ ਤੈਅ ਹੋਏ ਆ। ਜੋ ਛੋਟਾ ਘੱਲੂਘਾਰਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਉਹਦਾ ਪੰਥ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਸ਼ ਦਰਜ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜੋ ਨਿਕ ਸਜੇ ਰਾਜ ਲਹੇ ਮਰੇ ਗੁਰਪੁਰ ਜਾਏ, ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਸ ਘੇਰੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਨਿਕਲ ਗਿਆ ਉਹਦਾ ਇੱਕੋ ਹੀ ਕੰਮ ਆ ਰਾਜ ਸਥਾਪਿਤ ਕਰਨਾ। ਮਰੇ ਗੁਰਪੁਰ ਜਾਏ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸ਼ਹੀਦ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਉਹ ਗੁਰੂ ਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਚਲੇ ਗਏ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਮੇਵਾਰੀ ਪੂਰੀ ਕਰ ਲਈ। ਵੱਡੇ ਘੱਲੂਘਾਰੇ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਅੱਧੀ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੀ ਪਾਪੂਲੇਸ਼ਨ ਖਤਮ ਹੋਈ, ਉਦੋਂ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਤੱਤ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਲੈ ਗਏ, ਉਹ ਗਿਆ ਉਹ ਸਖੋਟ ਗਵਾਏ, ਕਿ ਹਾਲੇ ਵੀ ਤੱਤ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਜਿਉਂਦਾ ਆ। 6 ਮਹੀਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਿਸਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਫਿਰ ਰਾਜ ਸਥਾਪਿਤ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਨਿਸ਼ਾਨਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਹੀ ਕਰਨਾ ਆ। ਤੀਜਾ ਘੱਲੂਘਾਰਾ 1984 ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲੋਂ ਹੀ ਸੰਤ ਜਰਨੈਲ ਸਿੰਘ ਨੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਗੱਲ ਕਹਿ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਇੱਥੇ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਦੀ ਨੀਂਹ ਰੱਖੀ ਜਾਊਗੀ। ਹੁਣ ਉਹ ਨੀਂਹ ਰੱਖੀ ਹੈ। ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਾਬਾ ਬੰਦਾ ਸਿੰਘ ਬਹਾਦਰ ਦੇ ਰਾਜ ਨੂੰ 1716 'ਚ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਡਿੱਗਦਾ ਆ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਤਕਰੀਬਨ ਜੇ ਮਿਸਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਰਾਜ ਲੈਣਾ ਆ 50 ਸਾਲ ਲੱਗਦੇ ਆ ਮਿਸਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਰਾਜ ਆਉਣ ਨੂੰ, ਅਤੇ ਪੂਰਨ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਮਹਾਰਾਜਾ ਰਣਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਦੇ ਰਾਜ ਆਉਣ ਨੂੰ ਆਲਮੋਸਟ 80-85 ਸਾਲ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ। ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ 40 ਸਾਲ ਹੋਏ ਆ ਇਸ ਜੰਗ ਨੂੰ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਦੇ ਰੂਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਕਿ 40 ਸਾਲ ਹੋਰ ਲੱਗਣੇ ਆ। ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਤਾ ਕਿ 400 ਸਾਲ ਲੱਗਣੇ ਆ। ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਭਾਈ ਜਿੰਦੇ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਆਪਣਾ ਕੰਮ ਆ ਸੰਘਰਸ਼ ਕਰਨਾ, ਜਿੱਤਣ ਹਾਰਨ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਉਹ ਗੁਰੂ ਦੇ ਹੱਥ 'ਚ ਆ। ਖਾਲਸੇ ਨੇ ਸੰਘਰਸ਼ ਕਰਨਾ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਕਹੀ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਸੰਘਰਸ਼ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸਦੀਵੀ ਆ। ਇਹ ਨਾ ਹੀ ਖਾਲਿਸਤਾਨ 'ਤੇ ਖਤਮ ਹੋਣਾ ਆ, ਕਿ ਉੱਥੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਹੋਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਡਿੱਗੇ ਹੋਏ ਲੋਕ ਆ, ਅਪਰੈਸਡ ਮਾਈਨੋਰਿਟੀਜ਼ ਆ, ਫਿਰ ਖਾਲਸੇ ਨੇ ਗੁਰੂ ਦੇ ਰੂਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਲਈ ਖੜਨਾ। ਸੋ ਆਪਣਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸੰਘਰਸ਼ ਹੈ, ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਦੇਖੀਏ ਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਸੰਘਰਸ਼ ਸਦੀਵੀ ਆ, ਅਸੀਂ ਸਿਰਫ ਆਪਣੇ ਲਈ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੜ ਰਹੇ, ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਹੀ ਸਾਡੀ ਐਥੀਕਲ ਅਤੇ ਮੋਰਲ ਕੰਪਸ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਉਹ ਸਹੀ ਪਾਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ ਆ। ਅਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਗੱਲ ਖਤਮ ਕਰਦਾ ਹਾਂ। ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਲੱਗੀ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰੀਏ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਕਿਸ ਮਕਸਦ ਨਾਲ ਆਏ ਹਾਂ, ਕੀ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਅਕੰਪਲਿਸ਼ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਹਫ਼ਤਿਆਂ ਮਹੀਨਿਆਂ ਸਾਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿਹੜੇ ਕਿਹੜੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਹੋਰ ਹਾਲੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਲੀਕਣੇ ਆ। ਸੋ ਹੁਣ ਮੈਂ ਗੱਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਅਖੀਰਲੇ 2 ਸਪੀਕਰਸ ਭਾਈ ਦਵਿੰਦਰਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕਰੂੰਗਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇੱਕ ਰਿਸਪੌਂਸ ਆ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੈ, ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ, ਪਰ ਕਿਹੜਾ ਜਵਾਬ ਜਾਂ ਰਿਸਪੌਂਸ ਅਸੀਂ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਏਜੰਸੀਜ਼ ਵੱਲੋਂ, ਅਤੇ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਉਹ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਅਚੀਵ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਤਤਪਰ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਆ। ਭਾਈ ਦਵਿੰਦਰਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ।
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਦਾਸ ਥੋੜ੍ਹੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਜੀ ਉਹ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ 'ਚ ਗੱਲ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦੀ, ਫਿਰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ 'ਚ ਹੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰੀਏ, ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸਿਰਫ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਸਰਕਾਰਾਂ 'ਤੇ ਕੌਨਸਨਟਰੇਟ ਕਰਨਾ, ਅਤੇ ਭਾਈ ਪ੍ਰਭਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਨੇ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਬਾਰੇ ਕਰਨਾ। So what I'm going to talk about is the responsibility of individual states. The UN Human Rights Commissioner, Volker Turk, in the 56th session of the UN Human Rights Council said, the trend of transnational repression against certain individuals and communities was becoming a global issue and urged states to have zero tolerance for such actions. ਇੱਥੇ ਦੇ UN Human Rights Commissioner ਵੀ zero tolerance ਹਰ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਕੋਲ ਹੋਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ। So the reason why I'm going to now carry on that theme in English, what does zero tolerance mean? And I'm going to try and link some of the speakers. So when you heard the speech in German, ਆਪਣੀ ਬੇਟੀ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਪੀਚ ਸੀ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬੰਦੇ ਜਰਮਨ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਦੇ ਸੀ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਈ ਇਸ਼ਾਰੇ ਇਸ ਪਾਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਹੋਏ ਸੀ। So in her speech, she gave the example of the German government. The German government have zero tolerance for Indian spies spying on Sikhs in Germany. And they've demonstrated that through finding them, arresting them, charging them, and imprisoning them. That is what zero tolerance looks like. Why do other states not do the same? We've been told in our various meetings with our various contacts that Germany is now leading the campaign of transnational repression, bringing together 45 different countries. It was originally the US before Donald Trump, but now it's Germany. So my message to Sikhs from Germany is your responsibility is more than us, from the UK or Canada, from America, because your government is effectively leading this fight, and they've demonstrated it through your laws. So now let me talk practically. What does zero tolerance look like? And I'm going to focus on the state's responsibility. I'm not going to try and repeat some of the things that are going to be in the press conference and will be in the report, but just to give you that sense of, firstly, we need transparency. We need it to be absolutely crystal clear that if a foreign government, in our case the Indian government, is targeting Sikhs in the countries you live in, then what we don't want is what the UK does. What we don't want is what Italy does, which is they expel raw agents but don't say why. Where is the transparency for the communities that live in those countries? In fact, the exact opposite should be true. You should be saying, we are expelling this person that works for the Indian intelligence because of the following reason. That is the only message that you can send to any foreign government, in this case, the Indian government. So when there were two plots, two plots in Italy, one person who was going to be assassinated doesn't even know. How was that found out? A Jewish journalist spoke to the Italian intelligence, and they said, yeah, we expelled a person because in Milan they were going to kill so-and-so. She actually didn't mention the name. I'm not going in that direction, but there was another plot. So these are two plots. So Italy chose the UK route. Chop kite bande nu kad do, the gal baar na aave, because they're worried about relationships with India. In Canada and the US, we've seen a mixed response. Yes, they've had to go public because somebody's been killed, there's been a plot, and the media have brought this out. So one thing is transparency. And the other thing that really comes from the Canadian case, but this is a message to all governments, is accountability. Who is going to make, in our case, India accountable for challenging the sovereignty of Canada, the US, the UK, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Belgium? These are some of the countries that have been mentioned. When Jagwinder Singh was killed in Belgium on the 17th of April 2007, shot dead, there was no robbery. It was suppressed. Jagwinder Singh was on the hit list back then. But no one has ever been. It's unsolved murder. And those of you that come from Belgium, you know Jagwinder Singh and what Jagwinder Singh did. So this is something that's been with us. And because governments chose not to do anything, maybe a raw agent from Belgium was expelled, but we don't know about it. So this thing about transparency and accountability in the Canadian American case, from recent cases, is this is not about Gupta. This is about Vikram Yadav. This is about Vikram Yadav reporting to Samit Goyal. This is about Samit Goyal reporting to Ajit Doval. Ajit Doval reporting to Amit Shah and Modi. Accountability needs to go to the top, because I said, Modi used those words. We didn't. We go into your homes and we kill you. We don't give dossiers. So accountability is key. And I think the other complicated issue is, how do states adopt tactics to deal with the likes of India? Trade will always be there. And I think as Sikhs, we are very clear. We stand on the truth. We tell it the way it is, irrespective of the consequences. That's what we expect the countries we live in to do the same. To do all these things, because that is the only way, and I'll go back to the words of the UN Human Rights Commissioner, whose staff was here earlier today. And that's a message I know will go from these interviews and these clips back to India. This is not about the Sikh Federation International and the Baku Initiative Group. There are member states of the UN, Canada, Germany, UK. There are many others, the 45 I mentioned. This is an issue that concerns them all. This is an issue that in the coming weeks, as Maninder Singh said, this is the start of conversations. The message from this will go out that we are going to also hold our own governments accountable, but in a nice way, because ultimately the ones carrying out the transnational repression are India. And I'm probably going to stop there. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So I'll keep it shorter than that, just given the time that we're at right now. And I'm going to make most of my comments in Punjabi as well, just picking up from some of the other comments that Devinderjit Singh and Maninder Singh had mentioned as well, because we're going to be covering a lot of this stuff in the press conference this afternoon as well. So ਜਦੋਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਤੇ ਜੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੀ ਉਦਾਹਰਣ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ 2-3 ਸਾਲ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਹਾਲਾਤ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ, ਅੱਜ ਹਾਲਾਤ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਦੇ ਹੈਗੇ, ਵੀ ਮਾਰਕ ਕਾਰਨੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦਾ ਪ੍ਰਧਾਨ ਮੰਤਰੀ ਹੈਗਾ, ਪਿਛਲੇ ਜੂਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮੋਦੀ ਨੂੰ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਉਹਨੇ ਸੱਦਿਆ, ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਹੁਣ ਆਪ ਵੀ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਆਇਆ, ਅਤੇ ਜਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੁਣ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਨੋਰਮਲਾਈਜੇਸ਼ਨ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਟ੍ਰੇਡ ਟਾਈਜ਼ ਕਰਕੇ, ਵੀ ਹਰ ਵਾਰ ਪਿਛਲੇ 40 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਅਤੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਜਿੰਨੇ ਵੀ ਸਟੇਟ ਹੈਗੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਨਿੱਜੀ ਮਫਾਦ ਅਤੇ ਆਰਥਿਕ ਮਫਾਦ ਮੁੱਖ ਰੱਖਦੇ ਹੋਇਆ ਉਹ ਜੋ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਹੱਕਾਂ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਜਾਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਮਸਲਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਉਹ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਧੱਕ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਆ। ਜੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਦੀ ਉਦਾਹਰਨ ਆਪਾਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਜਦੋਂ 84 ਵੇਲੇ ਜਦੋਂ SAS ਨੇ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੀ ਮਦਦ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀਗੀ, ਜਦੋਂ ਮਾਰਗਰਟ ਥੈਚਰ ਨੇ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਦੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ 'ਤੇ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਾਰਵਾਈ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹਦਾ ਮਸਲਾ ਇਹੀ ਸੀਗਾ ਵੀ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਨੇ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਨੂੰ ਹੈਲੀਕਾਪਟਰ ਵੇਚਣੇ ਸੀਗੇ। ਜੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੀ ਐਗਜ਼ਾਮਪਲ ਕੁਝ ਸਾਲ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਦੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਵੀ 2017 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਭਾਈ ਹਰਦੀਪ ਸਿੰਘ ਦੀ ਸ਼ਹਾਦਤ ਤੋਂ 4-5 ਸਾਲ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਹੀ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਸਰਕਾਰ, ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਖੁਫੀਆ ਏਜੰਸੀ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਗਿਆ ਸੀਗਾ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਰੌ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤਾਣਾ ਬਾਣਾ ਉਹ ਬੁਣ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹ ਕਾਫੀ ਬੜੇ ਮੱਚ ਵਿਆਪਕ ਪੱਧਰ 'ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਨੈਟਵਰਕ ਸਥਾਪਿਤ ਕਰ ਲਏ ਸੀਗੇ। ਜਦੋਂ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੀ ਖੁਫੀਆ ਏਜੰਸੀ ਨੇ ਸੀਸਿਸ ਨੇ ਪ੍ਰਾਈਮ ਮਿਨਿਸਟਰਸ ਆਫਿਸ ਤੱਕ ਪਹੁੰਚ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀਗੀ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਕਾਰਵਾਈ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਤਾਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਰੀ ਨਾ ਕੀਤੀ ਗਈ ਸੀਗੀ ਵੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਕੋਈ ਐਕਸ਼ਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨੀ, ਕੋਈ ਕਾਰਵਾਈ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨੀ। ਕਾਰਨ ਕੀ ਸੀਗਾ? ਕਾਰਨ ਇਹੀ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਮਹੀਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਜਸਟਿਨ ਟਰੂਡੋ ਹੀ ਪ੍ਰਧਾਨ ਮੰਤਰੀ ਸੀਗਾ, ਕੁਝ ਮਹੀਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਦੀ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਫੇਰੀ ਹੋਣ ਲੱਗੀ ਸੀਗੀ, ਅਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਵੀ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਕੋਈ ਕਾਰਵਾਈ ਕੀਤੀ ਤਾਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਫੇਰੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵਿਘਨ ਪੈਣਾ ਆ ਅਤੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਨੂੰ ਦਾਲਾਂ ਵੇਚਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਸੋ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ। 4-5 ਸਾਲ ਬਾਅਦ ਉਹੀ ਨੈਟਵਰਕ, ਉਹੀ ਜੋ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਇਨਫਰਾਸਟਰਕਚਰ ਸੈੱਟ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀਗਾ, ਉਹਦੀ ਵਰਤੋਂ ਕਰਦਿਆਂ ਹੋਇਆਂ ਭਾਈ ਹਰਦੀਪ ਸਿੰਘ ਨੂੰ ਸ਼ਹੀਦ ਕੀਤਾ, ਅਤੇ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਆਪਣੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਨੂੰ, ਆਪਣੇ ਭਾਈਚਾਰੇ ਨੂੰ ਵਿਆਪਕ ਪੱਧਰ 'ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਹਿੰਸਾ ਵਰਾਈ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੁਣ ਅੱਜ ਤੱਕ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆ। ਸੋ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਰਿਪੋਰਟ ਆਪਾਂ ਤਿਆਰ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈਗੀ, ਜਿਹਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਕੁਝ ਘੰਟਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪ੍ਰੈਸ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਜਾਰੀ ਕਰਨਾ ਆ, ਉਹ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਹ ਜਿੰਨੇ ਵੀ ਐਕਸ਼ਨ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਨੇ ਲਏ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਵਿਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਕੈਨੇਡਾ, US ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਜਰਮਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਯੂਰਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਜਿੱਥੇ ਬਰੀਕੀ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਾਂ ਸਾਰੀ ਡਾਕੂਮੈਂਟੇਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਕੇ, ਸਾਰੇ ਰੈਫਰੈਂਸ, ਸਾਰੇ ਸੋਰਸ ਦੇ ਕੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਡਾਕੂਮੈਂਟੇਸ਼ਨ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਵੀ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਐਕਸ਼ਨ ਕਿਹੜੇ ਰਹੇ ਆ। ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਰੈਕਮੈਂਡੇਸ਼ਨ ਅਤੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਕਾਰਵਾਈ ਅਗਲਾ ਸਟੈਪ ਸਾਡਾ ਕੀ ਹੋਣਾ, ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਮੈਂ ਸੰਖੇਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਬੇਨਤੀਆਂ ਕਰਨੀਆਂ ਹੈਗੀਆਂ। ਇੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਭਾਈ ਮਨਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਨੇ ਮੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪਰਮਾਨੈਂਟ ਮਿਸ਼ਨਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ, ਅਤੇ UN ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਰੈਪਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਟੇਟਿਵ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ, ਸੀਨੀਅਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਅਫਸਰ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ, ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲ ਰੈਪੋਰਟਰਸ, ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਸਾਲ ਕਈ ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਕਈ ਵੀਰ ਭੈਣ ਲੱਗੇ ਹੋਏ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਆਪਣਾ ਰਾਬਤਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਕਾਇਮ ਹੈਗਾ। ਸੋ ਇੱਕ ਕੰਮ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਪਰਮਾਨੈਂਟ ਮਿਸ਼ਨਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਣੀ ਰੈਕਮੈਂਡੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੈਗੀ ਵੀ ਜੇ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਵਪਾਰ ਕਰਨਾ ਵੀ ਹੈਗਾ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਣੇ ਐਗਰੀਮੈਂਟਸ ਵੀ ਤੈਅ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਸ਼ਰਤਾਂ ਹੋਣੀਆਂ ਚਾਹੀਦੀਆਂ ਵੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਐਕਟਿਵਿਸਟ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਕਾਨੂੰਨੀ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਦੁਰਵਰਤੋਂ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾਂਦੀ ਆ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਰੋਕਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੁਝ ਸਟੈਪ ਨਿਯਮ ਆਪਾਂ ਤੈਅ ਕਰਨੇ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਮਨੁੱਖੀ ਅਧਿਕਾਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਤਰਜੀਹ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਹੋਇਆਂ ਉਹ ਬੜੀ ਮੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਐਗਰੀਮੈਂਟਸ ਤੈਅ ਹੋਣੇ ਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਖਾਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਵੀਜ਼ਨ ਹੋਣੇ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਆ। ਪਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੇਨ ਗੱਲ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਤਜਰਬੇ ਤੋਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਸਪਸ਼ਟ ਹੈਗੀ ਵੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਸਟੇਟਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਮਫਾਦ ਵੇਖਣੇ ਆ। ਜਿਹੜਾ UN ਸਿਸਟਮ ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਨਫਰਾਸਟ੍ਰਕਚਰ ਹੈਗਾ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਹਿਊਮਨ ਰਾਈਟਸ ਕਾਊਂਸਲ ਦਾ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਵੇਖਣ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਹਦੀ ਵਰਤੋਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਰਨੀ ਹੈ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਸਾਲ ਫੈਡਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਜਦੋਂ UN ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲ ਰੈਪਰਟਰ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਸ਼ਿਕਾਇਤ ਦਰਜ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀਗੀ ਵੀ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਇਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ। ਜਨਵਰੀ 2025 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਸਾਲ ਉਹ 4-5 ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸੀਨੀਅਰ ਅਫਸਰ ਹੈਗੇ UN ਹਿਊਮਨ ਰਾਈਟਸ ਕਾਊਂਸਲ ਦੇ ਸੀਨੀਅਰ ਮੋਸਟ ਪੋਜੀਸ਼ਨ ਤੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਰਲ ਕੇ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਜਨਤਕ ਚਿੱਠੀ ਲਿਖੀ ਸੀਗੀ 15-16 ਸਫ਼ਿਆਂ ਦੇ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪੂਰੇ ਤੱਥਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਵੇਰਵਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ pretty much ਐਲੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਲਾਏ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਖਾਲਿਸਤਾਨ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਤੇ ਮਨੁੱਖੀ ਅਧਿਕਾਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਖਤਮ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਸਤੇ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਚੁੱਪ ਕਰਾਉਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਹਮਲੇ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ। ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਸਪਸ਼ਟੀਕਰਨ ਲੈਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਚਿੱਠੀ ਲਿਖੀ ਸੀਗੀ। ਉਹਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਜਵਾਬ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਚਕਾਨਾ ਅਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਹਾਸੋਹੀਣ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਵਾਬ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਪਰ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਸਟੈਪ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇੱਕ ਕਦਮ ਆਪਾਂ ਪੁੱਟਿਆ ਸੀਗਾ, ਹੁਣ ਉਹਦੀ ਅਗਲੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਾਰਵਾਈ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲ ਰੈਪਰਟਰਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਅਤੇ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਹੋਰ ਅੱਗੇ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾਵਾਂਗੇ। ਵੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇੱਕ ਚਿੱਠੀ ਲਿਖੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਜਨਤਕ, ਹੁਣ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਖੁਦ ਇਨਵੈਸਟੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਕੇ ਡਾਕੂਮੈਂਟੇਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵੀ ਮੁਲਕ ਅਫੈਕਟਡ ਹੈਗੇ ਇਸ ਮਸਲੇ ਦੇ ਸੰਬੰਧ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਹੋਵੇ, ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਹੋਵੇ, ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਹੋਵੇ, ਇੰਡੀਆ ਵੀ ਹੋਵੇ, ਰਿਕੁਐਸਟ ਪਾਉਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਆ ਵੀ ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲ ਰੈਪਰਟਰਸ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਮੁਲਕਾਂ ਦੀ ਉਹ ਖੁਦ ਫੇਰੀ ਕਰਨ, ਆਪਣੇ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਨੂੰ, ਆਪਣੇ ਲੀਡਰਸ ਨੂੰ, ਆਪਣੇ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਆਰਗੇਨਾਈਜੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਨੂੰ ਉਹ ਮਿਲਣ ਅਤੇ ਉਹ ਆਪ ਉਹ ਰਿਪੋਰਟ ਕਰਨ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਗਰਾਊਂਡ 'ਤੇ ਉਹ ਕੀ ਵੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਆ, ਉਹ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਦਾ ਤਜਰਬਾ ਕੀ ਰਿਹਾ, ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੀ ਕਾਰਵਾਈ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਦੀ ਰਹੀ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਹ ਮੁਲਕ ਹੈਗੇ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਇਹ ਹਮਲੇ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਨਾਕਾਮੀਆਂ ਕਿੱਥੇ ਰਹੀਆਂ। ਅਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੀ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਮੰਗ ਰੱਖ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ UN ਐਕਸਪਰਟਸ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਅਗਵਾਈ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਇਨਵੈਸਟੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ UN ਬਾਡੀਜ਼ ਵੱਲੋਂ। ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਵੇਖਿਆ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਟਲੀ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ, ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਅਤੇ ਹੁਣ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਵੀ ਮੁਲਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਸੀਮਿਤ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਬਾਹਰ ਕੱਢਦੇ ਆ, ਜੇ ਉਹ ਕੱਢਦੇ ਵੀ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ। ਸੋ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਪਾਰਦਰਸ਼ਤਾ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇੱਕ ਇੰਡੀਪੈਂਡੈਂਟ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਨਵੈਸਟੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਪਰਸੂ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ UN ਐਕਸਪਰਟਸ ਹੈਗੇ ਅਤੇ ਲੀਡਰਸ਼ਿਪ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਇੰਡੀਪੈਂਡੈਂਟ ਫੈਕਟ ਫਾਈਂਡਿੰਗ ਮਿਸ਼ਨ ਸਥਾਪਿਤ ਕਰਨ ਵੀ ਜੋ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੀ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਰਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਕਾਰਵਾਈਆਂ ਹੈਗੀਆਂ ਸਾਰੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਭਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਤਫਸੀਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਨਿੱਠ ਕੇ ਉਹਦੀ ਇਨਵੈਸਟੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਨ, ਤੱਥ ਇਕੱਠੇ ਕਰਨ। ਨਾਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਚੇਨ ਆਫ ਕਮਾਂਡ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਵੀ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਭਾਜੀ ਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਜ਼ਿਕਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈਗਾ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਨਿਖਲ ਗੁਪਤਾ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਮਤਲਬ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗਾ, ਪਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਦੇਸ਼ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ, ਅਜੀਤ ਡੋਵਲ ਵਰਗੇ, ਸਮੰਤ ਗੋਇਲ ਵਰਗੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਥੋੜ੍ਹੀ ਮਚ ਆਈਡੈਂਟੀਫਾਈ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਇਨਵੈਸਟੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ। ਅਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਫਿਰ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਜੋ ਅਕਾਊਂਟੇਬਿਲਿਟੀ ਅਤੇ ਪ੍ਰੀਵੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਜੋ ਰੈਕਮੈਂਡੇਸ਼ਨ 'ਤੇ ਕੰਮ ਹੋਣੇ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਸੰਬੰਧ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਾਂ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਪਰਸੂ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਆਪਾਂ ਐਡਵੋਕੇਟ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਸੋ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਸਮੇਟ ਲੈਂਦਾ ਅਤੇ ਭਾਈ ਮਨਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਨੂੰ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕਰਦਾ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਅਗਲਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ।
We're approaching the conclusion of the event. I'd like to read out a joint statement on the final statement for the conference that the Baku Initiative Group and Sikh Federation International has jointly prepared with some recommendations and calling upon the United Nations and international partners as well. Participants of the conference titled Countering Indian Transnational Repression, Sikh Resistance and the United Nations expressed their serious concern over the growing pattern of transnational repression targeting the Sikh activists, human rights defenders and members of the Sikh diaspora in various countries. Participants note with concern documented examples of repression through various reforms, including covert surveillance, intimidation, harassment, disinformation campaigns, and acts of violence directed against Sikh individuals and organizations abroad. Such practices, when carried out across borders, constitute a serious violation of fundamental human rights and freedoms and undermine the principles of international law, as well as the sovereignty of states in which diaspora communities reside. Participants further expressed concern that following the killing of Sikh activists by Hardeep Singh Nijjar and by Avtar Singh Khanda, reports indicate that pressure, intimidation, and other forms of harassment against Sikh activists by the government of India have continued, particularly in countries such as the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and multiple European countries like Italy, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, and others. These violations raise serious concerns regarding the safety of the Sikh diaspora communities and the respect for international legal norms. The Baku Initiative Group reiterates its support for the legitimate and lawful struggle of the Sikh people to protect their fundamental rights, freedoms, and identity. The Baku Initiative Group also emphasizes the importance of raising issues of transnational repression within international institutions and ensuring that such activities are subjected to appropriate international oversight and investigation. The participants of today's conference call upon the United Nations, its relevant human rights mechanisms, and the international community to 1. Closely monitor and examine cases of transnational repression targeting Sikh activists and diaspora communities. 2. Promote accountability and transparency in cases involving intimidation, threats, harassment, or violence carried out beyond national borders. And 3. Strengthen international protections for diaspora communities, human rights defenders, and political activists. In particular, Baku Initiative Group and Sikh Federation International call on the international community as well as relevant international organizations, including the UN, its other relevant bodies such as the UNHRC and the UN Special Rapporteurs on the situation of human rights defenders, minority issues, and others to take meaningful steps to hold perpetrators of violence to account. Given the severity of the allegations, both organizations call on UN experts to launch an independent investigation into India's attacks in order to clarify the chain of command behind these operations, assess violations of international law, and identify appropriate accountability and prevention mechanisms. The participants reaffirm their commitment to continued engagement within international forums in order to raise awareness of these issues and to contribute to ensuring the rights of Sikhs and other communities in India. As final remarks, as we close the event, I have not going to repeat myself on some of the things that I've already said, but I do want to reiterate a few key points for today. Transnational repression against Sikhs is not an isolated phenomenon, as we know. It's long part of a continuum of attempts to silence people with a deep and historic and principled commitment to sovereignty and self-determination. Throughout this discussion, one theme has emerged that's unmistakable. The Sikh demand for political agency did not begin in the 20th century, nor is it a reaction to any singular event that has happened in the last decade or century. It's rooted in the doctrines of Miri Piri and Sarvata Pala, in the lived history of the Sikh gurus, and in centuries of Sikh governance, resistance, martyrdom, and ethical responsibility. For many Sikhs, the aspiration for Khalistan is understood within this long arc, a continuation of a political tradition grounded in justice, dignity, and the welfare of all. We have also confronted the reality of repression Sikhs face today: surveillance, intimidation, interference, and in some cases, targeted violence, and we know this extends far beyond India's borders. It reaches into our gurdwaras, our community spaces, our civic institutions in countries that pride themselves on democracy and the rule of law. The cases we have discussed, including the killing of Sikh activists abroad, underscore the urgency of international accountability and the need for states to protect the rights of their own citizens and residents. Yet, even as we examine these threats, we must also recognize the extraordinary resilience of the Sikh people. Across generations, Sikhs have refused to be silenced. They have refused to relinquish their history, their identity, or their political voice. Whether in Punjab or in the global diaspora, Sikhs have continued to organize, to advocate, and to articulate their aspirations with clarity and courage. This resilience is not accidental, it is inherited. It is the legacy of a community shaped by the sacrifices of 1984, by the decade of disappearances that followed, and the countless lives lost in the pursuit of dignity, justice, and sovereignty. Over 40 years ago, the foundations of the contemporary Sikh struggle were laid in the blood of our people. That history lives in our memory, in our institutions, and in our collective conscience. And because of that history, there is no turning back. Not for this generation, not for the next, not for any generation of Sikhs to come. ਕਈ ਸਿੰਘਾਂ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਇਹ ਸਵਾਲ ਇੱਕ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਕੁਝ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਆ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਵਾਰਨਿੰਗਸ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸਿੱਖ ਕਾਰਕੁਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਦੀਆਂ ਆ, ਦਾਸ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਛਲੇ 1-2 ਹਫ਼ਤਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਚੌਥੀ ਪੰਜਵੀਂ ਵਾਰਨਿੰਗ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਸਟੇਟ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਮਿਲੀ ਆ, ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਵਾਰਨਿੰਗ ਆ ਮੇਰੀ ਸਿੰਘਣੀ ਤੇ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਤੱਕ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਹੁਣ ਲੈ ਆਂਦੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਖਤਰਾ ਆ of imminent assassination. ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਇੱਕ ਬੰਦੇ ਦੀ ਜਾਂ ਇੰਡੀਵਿਜੂਅਲ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੀ। ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿਰਫ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਬੋਲੂਗਾ ਉਹ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਸਬਕ ਸਿਖਾਉਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਨੂੰ ਟਾਰਗੇਟ ਕਰ ਲਓ ਬਾਕੀ ਚੁੱਪ ਹੋ ਜੂਗੇ। ਹਰੇਕ ਵਾਰ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਹੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਆ। ਅਤੇ ਉਹਦਾ ਨੈਸੈਸਰਲੀ ਮਤਲਬ ਇਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਿ ਉਸ ਬੰਦੇ ਨੂੰ ਟਾਰਗੇਟ ਕਰਨਾ ਆ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੋਈ ਵੱਡਾ ਲੀਡਰ ਹੋਵੇ ਜਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਕੋਈ ਸੇਵਾਦਾਰ ਹੋਵੇ। ਸਾਡੇ ਵਰਗੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕੋਈ ਨਿਮਾਣੇ ਜਿਹੇ ਸੇਵਾਦਾਰ ਆ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਬਟ ਟਾਰਗੇਟ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਮਤਲਬ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਜਾਣੇ ਪਛਾਣੇ ਚਿਹਰੇ ਨੂੰ ਟਾਰਗੇਟ ਕਰੋ, ਉਹ ਬੰਦੇ ਚੁੱਪ ਹੋਣ, ਉਹ ਘਰ ਬੈਠਣ ਅਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੇ ਵੀ ਬਹਿ ਜਾਣ। ਜੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਬਹਿੰਦੇ ਫਿਰ ਭਾਈ ਹਰਦੀਪ ਸਿੰਘ ਨਿੱਜਰ, ਭਾਈ ਅਵਤਾਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਖੰਡੇਵਾਲਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਰੋ। ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਗੱਲ ਦੇਖਣ ਲਈ ਮਿਲੀ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਕੁਝ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਉਸ ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਐਨਾਲਿਸਿਸ ਉਹਦਾ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਵਾਬ ਦੇਣਾ ਪਿਆ। ਉਹ ਇਹ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਜਵਾਬ ਸੀਗੇ ਕਈਆਂ ਦੇ, ਉਹ ਵਿਕਟਮਹੁੱਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਆਉਣ ਲੱਗ ਪਏ। ਅਤੇ ਵਿਕਟਮਹੁੱਡ ਨਹੀਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਜੋ ਪ੍ਰੈਸ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੀਤੀ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਦੋਂ ਸਵਾਲ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੀ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਮੀਡੀਆ ਵੱਲੋਂ, ਉਦੋਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦ੍ਰਿੜਤਾ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਜਵਾਬ ਦੇਣਾ ਪਿਆ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਆਉਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਉਣ ਦਿਓ, ਫਿਰ ਲੈਟ them come। ਕੀ ਕਰ ਲੂਗੇ ਸਾਡਾ? ਅਲਟੀਮੇਟਲੀ ਸ਼ਹੀਦੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਂ ਮੌਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਦੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਆ। ਸਿੱਖ ਡੋਲੇ ਨਾ, ਸਿੱਖੀ ਕੇਸਾ ਸੌਂਸਾ ਸੰਗ ਨਿਭ ਜਾਵੇ, ਇਹੀ ਤਾਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਅਰਦਾਸ ਆ। These principles are utmost important in today's time। ਜਿੱਥੇ ਵੈਲਿਊ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੁਨਿਆਵੀ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਈ ਨੂੰ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਜੋ ਇੱਥੇ ਬਹੁਤਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੋਊਗੀ, ਜਿੱਥੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸ਼ਨਲਿਜ਼ਮ ਨੂੰ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਉੱਥੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਗੁਰੂ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਰਿਮਾਈਂਡ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਸੋ ਪੜ੍ਹਿਆ ਸੋ ਪੰਡਿਤ ਬਿਨਾ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਕਮਾਣਾ ਨਾ ਹੋ, ਕਿ ਨਾਮ ਦੀ ਕਮਾਈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਉੱਤਮ ਰਹਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ। ਗੁਰੂ ਦੇ ਆਸ਼ਰੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰਹਿਣਾ ਉਹ ਸਿੱਖ ਦਾ ਫਰਜ਼ ਆ। ਉਹ ਤੋਂ ਨਾ ਡੋਲੀਏ, ਬਾਕੀ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੁਛ ਉਹ ਤਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਰਹਿ ਜਾਣਾ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰਿੰਸੀਪਲਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆ, these are important for us as Sikhs। ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਗੁਰੂ ਗੋਬਿੰਦ ਸਿੰਘ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ ਦੇ ਦਰਬਾਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੈਨਾਪਤੀ ਨੇ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਕਹਿ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਸੀਗੀ ਗੁਰਸੋਭਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿ ਏਕ ਔਰ ਪਇਓ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਏਕ ਔਰ ਸੰਸਾਰ, ਸਾਡਾ ਨਜ਼ਰੀਆ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਨੂੰ ਦੇਖਣ ਦਾ, ਪਰਖਣ ਦਾ, ਉਹ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਵੱਖਰਾ ਆ। ਉਹ ਗੁਰੂ ਨੇ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਆ। ਸਾਰੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦਾ ਨਜ਼ਰੀਆ ਇੱਕ ਪਾਸੇ ਆ, ਸਿੱਖ ਦਾ ਨਜ਼ਰੀਆ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਉਹ ਹੋਰ ਪਾਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਆ। ਤਾਂ ਹੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਕਹਿ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਮੌਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਸਾਡੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਆ, ਸਾਡੀ ਜਿੱਤ ਆ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਨਜ਼ਰੀਆ ਹੀ ਵੱਖਰਾ ਆ। ਇਹ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਡੇ ਸ਼ਹੀਦਾਂ ਨੇ, ਸਾਡੇ ਗੁਰੂਆਂ ਨੇ ਸਿਖਾਇਆ। Ultimately, every generation of Sikhs has taken up the mantle of sovereignty in its own way, guided only by what the Guru has given to their Sikh as means to achieve it. And every generation will continue to do so. The form may evolve, the strategies may change, but the commitment remains constant, to assert the right of Sikhs to define their own political future, and to do so with integrity, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As we leave this conference, let us carry forward the clarity we have gained, the connections we have built, and the responsibilities we share. The path ahead is long, but it is guided by principles that have sustained Sikhs for generations. It moves in only one direction, forward, toward freedom, dignity, and the full realization of the Sikh right to self-determination in the form of Khalistan. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for participating. Thank you for listening. And to our partners from other communities, from Azerbaijan and the Baku Initiative Group, through media, through representatives of the UN, we thank them for their attendance, their support, and their solidarity in these moments. It's this solidarity that carries us forward, and it's this solidarity that will carry all of us forward to a better future. At this time, we are concluding the events of the morning session. Lunch is going to be served, so we ask everyone to please stay for that. We will reconvene at 2 p.m. at the Geneva Press Club. If anyone needs directions, we're here available here, where we will be releasing a joint report on transnational repression that will be submitted to the United Nations special mandate holders, to the UNHRC, and to the Office of the High Commissioner for the United Nations as well. So please stay for lunch, and we have another program at 2 p.m. at the Geneva Press Club. Thank you again for your attendance. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.